Hi, Dr. Michael McNeil here. Just to, it's it's the day before Valentine's Day. I got myself sorted because I was wandering around seeing all these guys with flowers. Thinking, why are these guys walking around with flowers? Because I've been away for work this week, and I'm sort of just glad to get back late last night. And I said, oh man, it's Valentine's Day, so I got myself sorted today, amongst other things, and doing Amazon returns for my wife and stuff. She'd ordered all this stuff, then doesn't want it, and then we got some stuff in sort of like the flat where one of our daughters lives, and so it's been one hour because I was hoping to do this early morning, in the sunshine, but unfortunately not. It's actually still really freezing cold, but even though it's middle of February, it's sort of like it's quite inclement at the moment. It's sort of like temperatures going down. We might have some snow at the weekend, so what I want to do today is it's a really, again, it's not sort of like something that you'd expect perhaps a philosopher to talk about overtly, but it's something that has enormous philosophical implications. And it's the relationship it's the relationship of the Christian believer to the law of God, or the law of Moses, or the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. All those words are appropriate. Now I would encourage somebody who hasn't, doesn't necessarily think, oh gosh, he's gone doing another religious video. I would say this is something which is really interesting to have in even if you've got, you think your faith's well established, or you've got no faith or whatever. This is something really useful, I think, this subject to have in your toolbox, so that, because this is something which I think is really under talked about. It was something that was very, very controversial within the Reformed world during the perhaps from the late from when, say, the mid 1950s, I think, was the first sort of commentary on this, and the person who made that commentary was somebody called R.J. Rushdoony. He really precipitated very much a renaissance in reform thinking, reform philosophy, and really considering the importance of the law of God and its place within the consciousness of not just of a believer, but it has enormous political implications, because he was very much dealing with, what's the role of all? Because if you read the books of Moses, and when you've got Genesis, which is obviously first things, which is very much a narrative book, sort of telling the story, the early history of the patriarchs, and then you've got Exodus, which is very much sort of like the story of the what happened to the nation which became Israel. The Exodus story of leaving Egypt, leaving as slaves, and what's really useful, by the time you get past, those sort of 9, 10, 11, when you start getting, say, what God, you've got the 10 Commandments, and then you've got all these other laws and discussions within the narrative, and the amazing thing, then you got sort of like the book of Numbers, which is, as it say, there's lots of enumerations, lots of sentences going on, but there's loads of stuff sort of like threaded through that through that book, which has ethical implications, and that's what I think people tend to miss. This is God speaking to a nation, and who are slaves, who have a slave mentality, who've never governed themselves, and he's actually telling them, starting from, this total base level, they've just been slaves and dependent for all this time, of how to run a nation. And when you get to sort of like to Deuteronomy, and especially the early chapters, you read in the early sort of like chapters of Deuteronomy, Moses is just about to leave, and God's told him that, Moses had a real sort of anger problem, which is encouraging for us, those of us who have an anger problem, who deal with, but it's also a warning, because, he lost his temper with the people who are being really, disobedient unsubmissive and subversive, and he just lost his temper with them, and as a result of that incident, it's an incident where the Lord told him to speak to the rock, and water would come out of the rock when people were complaining about thirst. And it said that Moses just lost his sort of like temper, took his staff, which is the sign of the authority of God, and hit the rock, and water started coming out of the rock. He said, have you rebels, have I got to show? He just lost it. And he, in a sense, he misrepresented God before the people. And the Lord sort of took that really very sort of like personally and said to Moses, because you've done that, you're going to lead the people up to the promised land, but you're never actually going to go into the promised land. And so he lost that sort of part of his destiny, and, which is a real, sobering fact for, for anyone you think about it. Let me just check if this is on. Yes, it is good. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure this was connected. I don't want to talk for sort of like for 2 hours. I realised the microphone's not switched on. That's what that little green light is telling me it's on. So I really want to speak a little bit about our relationship to the law of God, and whether or not it has any applicability for today. Because when people think about that, they immediately think, oh, this was the culture that God was trying to talk to the people about and get them to understand and to understand relations. Because I'm just reading Deuteronomy at the moment as part of my normal reading. I've just been reading those early books just in sort of, I just like to read sort of like, read the scriptures sequentially. I don't follow any plan or anything. I just literally read them sequentially. And I like to try and get through, I certainly get, try and get around, the scriptures at least once a year. And so I'm just sort of like reading through those again, and it's amazing reading sort of like Deuteronomy, and you're seeing how it's so easy to just skip over because of the way the narrative is. It's so easy to actually skip over. Right? Why is the Lord saying, this? Why is he saying? Why is he instructing them in this way? Why is, what's he saying? And because the Apostle Paul, in some of his quotes from sort of like from Deuteronomy, is very, very creative in his, in his use of what the narrative says. It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's narrative, you've got like surface meaning, and you've got the literal meaning. Like, say, for example, you shall not muzzle an ox when he's treading the grain. And to the surface reading and the surface meaning of that is, you shall not, you shall not, because they used to pull the oxes would be pulling, and the grain would be there, and they'd be sort of like trampling over it, and it'll be getting into the soil. And so what is actually sort of like saying is that, obviously the natural instinct of a hungry ox is going to be to eat some of this grain. So people would muzzle their animals to stop them from eating stuff. But what, there's a little bit of ecology there, isn't there? And that's the interesting thing. There's so much in sort of like in Deuteronomy where it's talking about how to treat the land, how to farm the land, how to rotate it. There's all this amazing wisdom about farming, about, how to leave land fallow for a number of years. It's sort of couched in what you might call cultic language, if you like, it's got like a spiritual flavor at times to the language, and say you will not defile the land but actually it's giving a lot of wisdom about the farmland. That's what happened. People over farm land, don't they? Over intensely farm land, and they don't let it fallow, and the land, then they have to chuck loads of fertilizer and stuff. So there's lots of really interesting practical implications of what's going on in these books. That's the thing. I think you can just think of it. If you think of them as religious books, you lose a lot of the wisdom and understanding that's actually in these books. So, just to actually treat them differently and look and that's partly because it is narrative. It is God speaking about sort of like himself, and the people, the chroniclers have put this sort of flavor to it. But you can actually, when you analyze it, when you sort of like say, what is this actually saying? It is amazingly interesting. So, but what's actually sort of there's two things really I want to do. I'm not sure how many. I'm not sure whether this will end up being broken up into quite a number of different videos. It might end up being a series. I've got that feeling. There's so much to talk about here, and because it's actually quite late already, I don't think I'll be able to do everything in one go tonight because I have to work tomorrow. So, but I am going to pursue this. I was sort of. It was a long drive home, sort of like last night, 7-8 hours. So I was listening to some sort of like material for this as well. In between listening to Dan Bongino and Megyn Kelly and else, I was sort of like listening to, studies in theonomy by sort of like Dr. Greg Bahnsen, which I will actually upload those, audio files and put a link in the description so anybody who wants them can get them, because they really are, exceptional quality of study. I mean, Theonomy and Christian Ethics, which is the Dr. Bunsen's famous book. He departed the earth too early, heart sort of complications. As a relatively young, sort of like a relatively young man, and it was a great loss to the scholarly world in general, because he was a great debater, and he debated at sort of like the University of California. I think you can still get some of his debates on there. He used to, engage atheist debaters, and he did his PhD at the University, I think, of Southern California, and he was well appreciated and well recognized. And as a scholar, whether you agreed with him or not wasn't the point, but he was recognized as somebody very, very confident. He's very, very thorough, very, very analytical. He was trained as an analytical philosopher. And he's very, and you can tell, so I know he went under, I think there was a period of a few years where he was under intense scrutiny and intense persecution, and the seminaries which he was supposed to be part of as a lecturer, they all, disputed his thesis and it got very quite unpleasant and personal. And there are recordings of him where he's responding to this criticism, and I think there's one in particular where you can tell he's really, really provoked, but he goes at it in such a rigorous analytical, like he just gets a philosophical machine guns out and just nails these people to the wall, and it's I will try and get that link out, because there is a series where he responded to all his criticism, because in many ways that was his earlier work. He's much more known in his later period as an apologist and for developing Van Tillian apologetics. But Theonomy, which is something I want to talk about, sort of like that perspective, which was the classical Puritan, Presbyterian. If you know anything about Presbyterians, the Westminster Confession, which is one of the finest, I think you get the shorter version, long version, but it's one of the finest sort of expositions, and in many ways a statement, a Christian philosophical statement about the nature of man and how we should organize our society. And it was the founding sort of, in a sense, the biblical principles that are found within that document, which were the Puritans envisaged a new world. Is why the States is as the States is today, is because of that Puritan influence. We can, it was part of the founding thread, and the influence of, Roger Williams and his attitude to religious pluralism, religious tolerance and stuff that defined the US. So these aren't sort of like abstract things and things that have no consequence to us today. We tend to, because of the secularization of our culture and the vested interest of people who've been pushing secularism, which is bankrupt in many ways. And it's, we should really know the history of the 20th century was the secular century, and there was more bloodshed in that century than probably most of the other centuries put together. It wasn't a triumph for secularism or atheism. There's no, we shouldn't be, intellectually intimidated by this stuff. New atheists are extremely loud, but they're also extremely ignorant. What's happening with Dawkins is actually quite interesting at the moment. So he's now calling himself a I think he's calling himself a social Christian or something. So he's somebody that believes in the social values of Christianity. Was it social? That's not quite right. He was calling that's the basic implication of what he's actually saying. So even though he's, he hasn't renounced his atheism or something, he's actually says that the values within the Christian society and Christian and what the, he's saying that those are the right sort of like values, of sort of like of tolerance and a lot. It's very refreshing when there are some honest atheists out there who actually will nevertheless will say, I mean, Richard Rorty said this as well, which is very interesting as a philosopher. He actually said that the basic moral teachings of Christianity and the Christian way of looking at the world is what defined the West. It really did define the West. And it also inspired, people, who are not part of the West, who took on parts of Western culture. This actually came out of Christianity. There's that wonderful study. I think it's called How Christianity Changed the World. He was a University of Chicago, I think, professor, and it's very famous study where he just enumerates how the Christian values influenced and changed the attitude to women, changed the attitude to society, what is valuable, changed the environment. There's a whole stream of stuff that people don't realize and just take for granted because it's been secularized. But where the ideas came from, a lot of people don't realize that, say, the early trade union movement, it was, they basically came from the levelers and the diggers who were egalitarian Christian groups that came out of Oliver Cromwell, who's a very famous sort of figure in British history. For a very brief period, we had a protectorate where the king, I think maybe it was Charles I, I think he got his head chopped off. Oliver Cromwell, English Revolution sort of time period, established a protectorate. I mean, unfortunately, it only lasted about 6 or 7 years. Charles II made this to their everlasting shame. As a Scot, I can say this, to the Scottish Presbyterians' everlasting shame. They made a ally with Charles II and got him back on the throne, in return for a promise that, the Presbyterian order of church will be throughout the land. And as soon as Charles II got back in, he basically evicted them all. He betrayed everybody. He evicted them all the ministers from there. Yeah. And in many ways, that was the death of unfortunately, that was the spiritual death of our nation. But it was, as far as the world was concerned, it was the birth of the American nation, because the Puritans and who came, who were Presbyterians, and it's a complicated story in its own right. But the Puritans who were going for religious freedom understood that the only way they could have religious freedom is they would have to leave Europe, and they, stopping off. I mean, interesting thing had happened in Amsterdam, in Amsterdam as part of the Netherlands, Holland. Holland is actually regions of the Netherlands. Netherlands is actually, but often people just call it Holland. It's an interesting a bit of historical confusion. Sometimes people don't understand that Holland is actually just parts. There's parts of Holland. It's part of the Netherlands. Netherlands is but that Netherlands had become a strong. They'd been persecuted by the Spanish, who were basically the Catholics in the Spanish at that time, where the Pope's private army. He crowned the emperor of the King of Spain as the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and his job was to go and to get rid of all the heretics throughout Europe. And he'd persecuted the Dutch Protestants and they tried to destroy all the dikes. Most of the Netherlands is actually under sea level, and they built up these dikes to reclaim the land. And the Spanish were breaking down all these dikes, trying to basically flood and drown the people. And the Dutch had sort of like sent a message to the surrounding Spanish army, sort of like saying that we'd rather drown and eat rats than than submit to the Pope, which was, that's still the spirit of the Dutch in many ways today. You can't tell them what to do. It's sort of like, which is a good and a bad thing, but you can see, but this sort of like that character of not of not giving up, of being stubborn, of having the right to have your own relationship with, you've got a right to have your own relationship and connection to God without going through some sort of hierarchy. Very much a Protestant idea. None of these papists or this priesthood nonsense. We've got an individual right to have a relationship with God, and that's sort of like translated into, when that gets secularized, isn't it? It's a very strong, rugged individualism. Same in the US, the very strong rugged. We're here as pioneers in the frontier, on the new frontier, and it sort of like gets into the psyche of people, sort of this very strong, rugged individualism. So I hope, that's sort of like a little bit of a background of sort of like why I want to sort of to talk about this sort of like this subject, because it really has, it's one of these sort of like themes within that people don't really appreciate. It's sort of, it's in the background of why our culture is like our culture, and why our relationship to, say, the law of God, and why that's so important. And it's also the issue, when I was thinking about this, first of all, it was also the issue of tithing within the Christian consciousness, because tithing is one of those things that really, really provokes people. It's like there's people who, written whole books about just, of the evils of tithing, and, how it's in the law. It's not for New Testament believers. I mean, it's something that's, there's people that have done whole series, who consider themselves Bible teachers and did sort of like a number of series, and they're only the only thing of theirs that you can still get on the internet is when they criticized tithing. People sort of like 10, 15 years ago, self-styled, considered themselves, teachers, Bible teachers, and they sort of like did all. They sort of like had their, early sort of, almost, it's a bit like an early, it's not quite a podcast, but it's sort of like, it's like people just filmed themselves sort of talking about different, they considered themselves sort of like independent, sort of like Bible teachers, but the only thing you can find of theirs is their books and their series on the internet about tithing. And the great irony of some of these messages is that, you go onto those websites, because my wife my wife's got her own reasons as to why she has some problems with tithing, and that's to do with her life as a single mother and her experience within the church, and how the church would demand, they would preach on tithing, and they would make it like, it's like, your sacred duty. You had to give, say, 10% of your income to the church, and if not, you were. I'm speaking hyperbolically here to just to make the point, but this is not too much off the point for some churches really do actually believe this. It's like it's as if if you're sort of like you're damning yourself, and you're robbing God by not tithing, and therefore tithing is very much something you do first. You do it you do it gross, on your gross income, and so 10% of your income goes to your local church, and that's it. No discussions, nothing. It's just like it's almost like God's taxing you. And so she's had a very bad experience of that, I think, within her with the church that she was involved in. They were very legalistic about it. It was very much considered something you had to do, and therefore she was struggling as a as a single mum with 3 daughters. And so, if anything, when you think about it, the church should have been helping her and providing and ensuring that, because she was the wounded party in that. There's, I don't want to betray too much of, what went on, but she was very much the wounded party in the relationship. I'm divorced. I had similar experience. I was the wounded party, from our, you're not perfect. There's always, but but there is blame, isn't there? There's that you can apportion blame in situations like that. If one party's sort of like committing adultery, then they're at fault. There's no ifs and buts or maybes about that. You've destroyed your marriage relationship when that happens. So she had her own reasons, and she'd listened to sort of like one of these guys on tithing. This series, I think it was like 10 sort of, probably, I don't know, maybe 10 hours or something of material. And she said, "Oh, you have to listen to this because this is really good." And, and he was basically sort of like anti-tithing, he'd come out against it. And I think maybe the first 3 or 4, it was quite interesting listening, because he had like lots of these details about what the tithe was and how they did the tithing. And he dealt with some of the, perhaps some of the details around tithing, which people sometimes push, and which was okay. It was, but by sort of the late ones, something on the inside of me really started to sort of like bulk at what he was saying. And so, it was for me, my final response to it, I think, was, because I did listen to them all, because I said to her that I would actually listen to all. And, but I think my final response was, at the end, was that I ended up giving probably one of the biggest offerings I'd ever given. I just thought, I reacted, I said, no, I felt on the inside of me that this is the opposite. It's absolutely true that you should give to God because you want to give to God. It's like, that's perhaps one of the distinctive things about, say, the relationship of a new covenant believer. One of the things that is very most distinctive is that, in a sense, but God's not looking for people to worship him because they have to. He's looking to people who want to worship because they want to. This is part of, and even I think you can take this from the story of the book of Job. This is one of the great spiritual lessons in the book of Job, because the Satan figure, however you think about the Satan figure in the book of Job, one of the things he would actually was saying to God was that if Job only worships you because of all the things you do for him. He doesn't worship you because of you. And he said, and the way you can find that this is true is that if you strip him of everything that he's got, then he'll curse you to your face. And that is the message of Job. And there's 2 or 3 different iterations of that, isn't there? Satan comes back because God says, "All right, fine, right, but don't take his life." And so these disasters happen to Job. He loses everything. And then, but he doesn't renounce God. And you see this second sort of thing in the narrative where Satan comes to God again and says, "Oh, skin for skin, a man will do anything for his health. If you strip him and take away all his health, then he'll curse you to your face." And so this happens again. God says, "You're not allowed to kill him, but he's under, he's under your, he's in a sense, God's giving him authority in, within bounds, and Satan goes and attacks him. But although Job gets astonishingly depressed, and you have this great narrative, and it's one of the high water points of human, I think it's recognized as a piece of literature. It's one of the high watermarks of the piece of literature, the book of Job. It really is a really, really searching, asking the question, why is there evil in the world? And, what's God's relationship with evil, and why do the righteous suffer? And, people tend to, especially in the tradition that I'm in, they tend to they can't handle the Book of Job very well because of its message. But we'll have to leave that for some other time because the Book of Job is amazing. But one of the things is that, the messages of that book is that we should offer to God because we love God, not because we have to. I think that's one of the messages of that book. So that's not to negate, having said all that is not to negate the principle of the tithe and how important it is. And that's one of the things I'll be looking at, is actually understanding, where does it come from? Is it part of the law? Because often one of the immediate dismissals of tithing is, it's something that's in the law, and therefore it's not relevant for us today because it was part of the law. And so, that is one of the most common criticisms that you will hear of tithing. And I will say, there is tithing within the framework of the law, but tithing is not part of the law. Tithing is a spiritual principle. It's not a cultic principle or part of there was a particular interpretation of tithing within the Jewish cult, which is, when you say the Jewish cult, you just mean all the rituals and that are associated with bringing the offerings, bringing the sacrifices, bring all the stuff that's to do with how the people were instructed to relate to God through the priesthood. That's the cult. And so there is an interpretation of tithing and the way tithing works within, if you like, the cult of Israel. But tithing itself as a spiritual principle is something that predates the law, and it's also something that should be within the experience of the Christian. It's the interpretation and the manner of doing it is different. And that's part of what I want to sort of like to look at, is to consider the relationship between the Christian and the law, because I'm getting stuck with my words here, aren't I? One of the most important things to understand is that that when we say the law, and this is where the confusion comes across, because if you look at, say, in Matthew 5:17 to 19, I've got it queued up here because I want to. This is part of how what Jesus says about the law, and because it says here, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. Now, there is a textual problem with this word fulfill, which I will talk about. But but the immediate point is, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. Okay. And then verse 18, it says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of a letter will pass from the law until everything takes place. Okay. So, but one of the most common things that when people talk about our relationship with the law is that they will say, what Jesus meant here was that he was actually coming to fulfill everything, because that's what it says. Not what, until everything, nothing's going to pass away until all is fulfilled. But Jesus fulfilled it, therefore all the law passed away. But that makes nonsense of this verse, because it says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest stroke of a letter will pass from the law until everything takes place. Okay, and verse 19. So to re-emphasize this point, that there is a relationship between us and the law, it says, so anyone who breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. What was Jesus coming to do? He was coming to announce the new order, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. And so again, you can't just suddenly divorce yourself from the law, because it says here, so anyone who breaks the least of these commands and teaches them to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches others to do so will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So there is obviously considered by the virtue of these verses alone, there is some sort of continuing relationship with the law, and we need to understand what the law is, and we need to understand what is meant by the law here, and what our ongoing continual relationship with the law is, and that will help us to understand, in a sense, to understand what tithing is, and then because we have this relationship with the law, and because, how I introduced this talk was when I was talking about Deuteronomy and looking at all the laws and everything, actually understanding, right, if this is God's prescription for how a nation should be run, how it should be governed, how disputes should be settled, how a building code should be, there's all this stuff in those. It's amazing how ecology, economy, all these sort of like these principles, and then to actually understand what does it say about crime and punishment and the penal, what the penal sanctions. There's so much of this stuff in it, and that's what really, in a sense, what's called theonomy. Theonomy is, formed from theos and nomos, the Greek words, and theos, the law, nomos, the law of God. So theos is God, nomos is the law, and so it's the law of God, which is contrasted with what you might call, the battle cry of the Enlightenment, autonomy, which is like auto and nomos. So you've still got the same word nomos, but auto, self, so self-government. So you've got the government of God, theonomy, and then you've got your self-government or self-law, autonomy. And so, we tend to consider, autonomy sort of like a good thing. And again, I'm not completely saying, that there's not something that is very, they're words that need context, but this contrasting between the law of God and then autonomy, which is man sort of like exalting his own self, that is something that is the fundamental contrast that helps us understand why this has such big philosophical implications. Because if you've got we find that was part of the, if you like, the secular Enlightenment, because what people need to understand is that there was a Christian Renaissance and there was a secular Renaissance, and there was a Christian Enlightenment and there was a secular Enlightenment, and these two streams are together. The Reformation was part of this great change in the way people considered, the great breaking up of the Hagonomy and the abuse of the Catholic Hagonomy. That breaking up is what the Reformation was trying to do. And in many ways, the sort of the secularization of the Reformation and the denial of the divine authority, all those things sort of like pulled out. These are real big philosophical themes that people don't tend to appreciate. So this is really, so as I go, I'm going to have sort of like a break here, because I think I managed to speak for 30, 45 minutes or whatever it is. Yep, 38 minutes. So, but that's, if you like, a preview of what I actually want to talk about, because I can see this being, three distinct bits, and it's like hooks into other stuff. I mean, this is very much some of what, this is very much what I was looking at when I was doing my master's thesis, and not so much my doctorate, but my master's was considered an exceptional piece of work. I got a special commendation from the university for it. So and I want to publish it. The PhD sort of book is now, I actually heard from the publisher again, sort of like it's now being copy edited by somebody. So it's close. It's probably still, well, when I say close, it's closer than it was. I think it's like, between 6 and 8 months away. The text has been done for but you can't get it published quicker than you can. So, but I want to get the master stuff sort of like published as well, which is why I want to do this, stuff that's concentrating, about theonomical terms and what people might call, this might be an aspect of what people might call dominion theology, which is sort of like a bit like the equivalent of, it's a bit like when people sort of like talked about dominion theology, as far as theology is sort of like concerned, it's a bit like the equivalent of President Trump. Those people can get sort of like the equivalent of Trump derangement syndrome, where they, just because it says dominion theology, they react and go completely irrational and don't want to, anything that a dominion theologian might say, they're going to be on the opposite side of the argument. It's one of those things that's created such a reaction. It's, especially, sort of like during the sort of like the 80s, 90s, when in the sense that what people might loosely call the evangelical Christian world was beginning to come back in and develop some sort of political perspective, because they'd been in their own sort of like ghetto, since the 1920s, since the Scopes trial, what's called the Scopes evolution trial. People had retreated into sort of like into a ghetto and retreated from academia and retreated from engaging with culture other than to then evangelize people. They just thought, that Jesus is just about to come back. We just need to, grab people for the ark, and culture's apostate, and the Antichrist is coming. The world's finished. We just need to get people. Evangelism was the only thing that was happening, and so whereas dominion theology is the opposite of that in the sense it's actually saying that we need to engage in all aspects of culture to see where in the words in the one of my heroes in that respect, somebody called Abraham Kuyper, who did, I think it was 1898 when he actually did the lectures, and he does his wonderful things about how how the Christian perspective and Christian culture should be it has implications of things how to say to every sphere of life, and not in a Hegenomical sense or a sense of dominating or over it, because he was one of his great principles was something called sphere sovereignty, where he recognized that each discipline had its own principles and everything, but the responsibility of the Christian, or the responsibility is to actually think through, how do we go through this discipline consistent with the faith that we profess? There's a right and a wrong way to do science. I'm unequivocal and unabashed when I say that. There is a right and a wrong way of how to do engineering. And all this. How do we connect things? What does the Bible say about engineering? Does the Bible say anything about engineering? It actually does. That's the interesting. Or it talks about how to do things and how to conduct business in what you would say is the right way. And so these are very much, they're very much actually understanding how, what are the Ten Commandments? What are they? How do we apply the Ten Commandments? Because there's one there, if you are somebody that you might, something that was that was like a modernized version of the social gospel. One of the things people would sort of like would actually, was very popular at one time, sort of like, doing sort of like, had almost like a second coming in, sort of like in the 80s. Now some senior sort of like leaders got quite into this. And one of the things they would sort of say would be, well, God's told us, not to steal, but he hasn't defined theft for us. And so, and that, that is such a chronic misunderstanding. That is totally false, because the Ten Commandments, if you like, are statements of principle. And then you've got all these, you've got this enormous, narrative that flows from the other books of Moses that defines very, very, very clearly just what property is, just what theft is, just what stealing is. It's very, very clear. That is such a, but that's what people said. They basically wanted to, interpret, what the scripture says. They wanted to make it compatible with, with socialist and communist ideas. That's the long and the short of it, sort of. And so all those things, they're very much themes that I looked at during my masters, sort of, of the social gospel and there's the modern social gospel, because you had, Reichenbach, the social gospel movement sort of up to sort of like say that from 1870 onwards, he was reacting to the extreme poverty in New York. But then you got sort of like the evangelicals, the new evangelicals and the evangelicals of the 70s and the 80s. Quite a few of them picked this up. And then we had this reaction to Trump as well, as some other people sort of like picked that up as well. They're sort of, wanting to have some sort of compatibility between what you might think of as socialist ideas with trying to get some sort of scriptural justification for these ideas. And so they are all sort of things that very much that I was doing in my masters, which I think, this is almost like an advert for what would be the second book. But these themes, I think, are stuff where I do want to talk about this stuff. So hopefully, that's given sort of like an idea, but very briefly, I want to talk about for this particular series, those things are going to pop in and out depending what they are. But for this particular series, I want to talk about our relationship to the law of God, to the law of what we would call the law, the law and the prophets, or the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, whatever the Hebrew scriptures, all basically equivalent terms, and the new covenant believer, or the Christians who believe in the New Testament, or depending what particular stream you are here, or what's our relationship. So it's what is our relationship to the law, and then specifically to look at tithing, because I think that's I think it's that one's in a sense is. You could spend an enormous amount of time sort of like looking at the details of either of those two. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to give like a high level view to distill down exactly what the issues are, and then to push a particular point and say, this is the correct perspective. I'm not, there's details where there's plenty of space for people to have differing views on how to tithe and what does tithing mean. And it's fine. But it's absolutely correct that people should tithe. There's no ifs and buts or perhaps maybes about it. It's absolutely correct that they should. The scripture is very clear on the necessity of tithing. Now, I'm not, we'll be going into sort of like you're doing it from a willing heart and all this sort of other stuff that might come up, but just considering it objective, leaving aside all those subjective elements of it, how important it is. In many ways, the subjective element, you might say, has come very much more in for the new covenant believers. It's very much more to do with what's going on in your heart, giving from your heart. But the objective component of it is what is tithing, and why should we tithe? What's the biblical basis for it? So there we are. Right, there we are, 48 minutes. I'm sure I've already sort of commented that I should have stopped and had a break. So I am definitely going to have a break now, but I will be back to talk a bit more, because I think I can go for another hour or so before I have to think about tomorrow. Okay, God bless. See you shortly. Hi, it's Dr. Michael McNeil here again. Have a quick swig here. What I want to get into with this one is to deal with in the introductory one, I sort of like it. I was talking and want to think about a relationship to the law, and then specifically deal with tithing. So this relationship of the believer to the law of God, or to the Old Covenant or the Old Testament, or to how God was dealing with Israel. It's something that's amazingly misunderstood, I think, so let's consider this the Matthew 5, chapter 5, 17 to 19. It is perhaps if you understand this and how you interpret this verse, and then how it, then really you really, if you understand this correctly, just this small passage here, these 3 verses, and if you understand sort of like these verses content, what they're actually trying to say to you, and if you actually understand what Jesus's words are, then you can understand, you can avoid so much of the disputes and the strange things that happen, around these verses. So let's just read that passage again. Okay, so it's Matthew 5, so it's 17, verses 17 to 19. It says here, this is Jesus speaking. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I've not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them." Little detail there. Why he's saying the law or the prophets is because the law specifically would be considered, say, the books of Moses, the first 5 books. Genesis, what we would call Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They would be considered the law, because this is the law that came from God, because Moses wrote it. Now that's one use of the term the law. Now the law could also be used more sort of like generically to include all the Hebrew scriptures. So that's another usage of it, which is sort of like a more idiomatic, general sort of like usage. And so, but often, like Jesus is doing here, he's saying the law or the prophets. So the prophets obviously would be considered the prophetic writings. You have the minor prophets and the major prophets, but you've also got other stuff that is wisdom literature, like stuff like Psalms and prophets. And Jesus quotes from some of the Psalms and from the Proverbs and stuff. And there are quotes within, so he was aware of this work. So it's not as if these, when we talk about the law and the prophets, there's the idiomatic aspect of that as well, that it's talking about all this sort of stuff which was to later to become what we would call the canon of scripture. So that's another interesting sort of like general sort of like idea, is that the canonization of scripture, it was recognizing the internal coherence between these works. So it's not as if at some point people just decided, right, the old, what we call, because that's one of the criticisms people raise against, say, like the old Testament or the New Testament. They would say, well, these are completely arbitrary sort of like collections, and the Catholic Bible has got an extra few books that called the Apocryphal. They've got more books in their canon, but that to me is not a helpful way of understanding canonization. The canon is just recognizing through the early councils of the church, when they were considering which books should be considered part of the canon of scripture. They were just recognizing something that God had already done. And so, the reason why, in a sense, the apocryphal books, even though they might be included within, say, the Catholic Bible, or within, not necessarily just, they're recognized as, if you like, culturally significant and historically significant. But there are reasons why, mostly from the point of view of the quality of the narrative, or the fact that there was a geographical errors in the more historical errors as well. They are part of the literature of the Jewish people, and they therefore are very, very useful to have, because they give you cultural insights and stuff that was going on. A bit like the Book of Enoch as well. It gives you, even though it's not recognized as a scriptural book, it is very, very useful, because it gives a view of what the beliefs and the practice of the Pharisees and of the Jewish mystics and the leaders who were not pulled into sort of like into Christianity. They'd rejected Christianity, but they nevertheless had this sort of like apocalyptic, the whole idea of apocalyptic genre of literature within the Jew. It helps. It's very, very helpful to actually to understand, right, this is the cultural mix that is within, helps you understand, and contextualize the culture of the Hebrew understanding of the world. So it's very, very useful. One of the great challenges of dealing with literature, in the sense of dealing with historical books and ancient books, is actually understanding, right, you have to try and understand the culture, if you like, the cultural milieu of the era, and try and consider yourself as part of that. If I was there, what would this be saying to me? And so, that can be overdone. There's some postmodernists who would deny that that's possible at all, and therefore everything is just interpretation. Everything, we're always looking at stuff we can never get beyond our own prejudices, and that's been a very, very influential view in sort of like in the second part of the 20th century within postmodernism. Is this idea that you're trapped within you're within your own confirmation biases and your own way of looking at the world. You can never get outside of your own worldview. And there's something in that critique. There is some force in it, but I think I would say you can get far enough out of it that you can appreciate why you can get out of it far enough, and you can appreciate your own prejudices and your own confirmation biases enough that you can appreciate other perspectives. If you couldn't, then I don't think you could. You certainly couldn't do philosophy if that really was true, and you certainly couldn't. You couldn't have normal human discussions between people, and you would be stuck in sort of like the different ghettos of identity. That's what's happened when people have pushed this sort of like idea where you're a white male in the West. You can never understand me as a person of color from the East. And that's and the whole that is, if that is so socially destructive, if that is the case, there's all sorts, that's very common within Marxism and within critical theory, which is sort of neo-Marxism, the this sort of like idea that one group's oppressing another group, so we need to sort of to be able to get beyond that to make progress philosophically or culturally or socially. So after that sort of preamble, again, you see there's so many different interesting things that that just pop up and that are useful. But and it was very much that was just trying to contextualize the idea of law of the prophets. What are these terms, these synonyms? If you've never heard this before, you might think, what's the law? Why do you say the law and the prophets? Why does the law? So people say the Old Testament, they're all close synonyms depending on they're idiomatic. They have a detailed technical meaning, which is perfectly normal within any language. Within modern language, we do that as well. Words might have a technical or a scientific meaning, but they're nevertheless part of normal discourse. So we might use certain words just as when we're speaking, but when we're in a technical context, we mean something very, very different, or we certainly, and sometimes the idiomatic and the technical meanings can actually be almost like they can clash with one another. They can almost contradict one another. That which is part of the challenge of language, of actually understanding the context of language, or the language gain, as Wittgenstein would put it. Your language gain is governing your that's the overall context in which you use your words. That provides the interpretive framework, isn't it? So when that was just this little detail of wanting in Matthew 5:17, where it says, "Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets." Okay, so all the Hebrew scriptures he's saying I haven't come to do anything to those. And that's why it's important to understand that what the law and the prophets were. It says, I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. Now, the real interesting word here is the word fulfill. Now, the New Testament, the Christian scriptures, they're written in Greek. Now, the word that's translated from that's been translated fulfill is the verb pluruso, and the problem with sort of like with the word Pelusai, or depending what pronunciation you got. So I'm using the Erastian, which is a little bit the Erasmian, sort of like Rastian pronunciation. I think, because Erasmus was he was the there's Erastus and Erasmus. Erasmian, I think it's Erasmian, because it's Erasmus was he was actually Dutch. He took like a lot of Dutch, because of their name, complicated Dutch names. A lot of Dutch scholars would take anglicized names or English names as well as their own name. And he was somebody who was one of the early Enlightenment scholars who he communicated a lot with Luther. He sort of like exchanged a lot of, but he did a lot to do with sort of like with textual criticism, and he did quite a lot of work with sort of like with the Greek text. And so you get, because the language was lost in the sense, so, modern Greek is pronounced differently from, what people consider, the Koine Greek, the Greek of Alexander the Great, so there's this big argument. One of the arguments in Greek scholarship, New Testament scholarship, how should you pronounce words? But I learned the Erasmian pronunciation, so that's why I'm saying plurusai. And that's another interesting little detail there, because I think the most modern scholarship, I think it was much to do with the work of one, particularly, I think he was Greek as well. He's arguing that the Erasmian pronunciation is probably incorrect, that it should be pronounced much more like after the fashion of modern Greek pronunciation, which tends to pronounce a lot of the vowels the same. So you lose if you're trying to learn, in a sense, the Erasmian pronunciation sort of like helps you learn because you pronounce the vowels correctly, and not correctly, but you pronounce them distinctively. That's what I mean. But the point here is that the verb perusai is the one that's perhaps the most, it's the understanding what this means unlocks, I think, the, if you like, the riddle of why people find this passage so difficult to reconcile. Because perusai, this verb, is a very generic verb, so it has an enormous wide range. Its basic meaning is to sort of like to fill, or to fulfill, or to pack, or to pack a net full of fish, or it's very, very broad, and it's one of the big misunderstandings of language is that every word has just one and a very specific meaning. You have to consider the context of the sentence. That's one level. Then you have to consider what is the context of that sentence, what passage is that sentence in, and then you have to consider what book is it in, and then you have to consider, maybe there's a wider context, what does it mean in that culture? What does it mean? So there's lots of aspects of language. Sometimes people are very primitive in their discussion and say, what does the text literally say? And that's what I'm going to say. That's what people might call a primitive fundamentalist view of language, or not understanding, what's going into interpreting this, because you have to, because the verb's so generic, it's very difficult to pin down what it means just from this one verse. And that's why you get these very, what I would say, very erroneous interpretations of this, of when people say, well, and Christians aren't under the law, because the Apostle Paul says we're not under the law, which he does, but again, you have to look at what is Paul talking about. And when Paul's sort of like talking about that stuff, and when they had those arguments in Acts, when they went to the council of the elders, the issue that was at dispute there was, should the Gentiles be circumcised, which is a cultic practice. It's a practice to do with how the religion was practiced, the rituals, and when Paul and other places talks about, he, especially in Galatians, this is where a lot of this anti-law stuff sort of like comes. The antinomians, which is like people who say are anti the law of God and say that the law of God has got no consequence whatsoever for the new covenant believer. Galatians is often considered, the center of that, because Paul's really going after those people who'd become Christians, but then they were slipping back into the cultic practices of Judaism, and they had lost their Christian distinctives. And so he really sort of like goes after it and says, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. Cursed is everybody that hangs on the tree. And you have this, the law, the Christ is the end of the law. It's like, so what is Paul sort of like talking about there? Again, the context is very much is not talking about that the law has no significance for Christian beliefs, but he's saying, but the cult, that is what should be understood from those words, is that the cult and the practices, the new moons, because he says that you're practicing again, you're doing new moons and times and calendars, you're getting involved in all these sort of rituals connected with the cult of Judaism, and you're losing, the significance of Christ as being something that's beyond the fulfillment. And this is where we have to understand, right? What does this word this verb plusa, what is it actually meaning? What does it mean to fulfill? And so, as far as the cult is concerned, if the cult was a type or a picture or a figure of Christ who had come, and therefore to slip back into all these feasts and what they were signifying, and is to lose sight of that Jesus has come, the Christ is here, and the focus should be on the spiritual life, not these outward things that were pointing to Jesus. So the concept of fulfillment here, there's an enormous amount that revolves around, how to correctly understand what it means to fulfill here. So, but the thing is, the passage in Matthew 5 helps you understand the wider context, because immediately after he says this here, he says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I've not come but to fulfill them. Then you get in a sense, the admonition that comes off the back of this. I tell you the truth. In the King James, it says, for verily, verily, I say to you, the lovely poetic language. But it says, I tell you the truth until the actual Greek actually says, amen. So amen, I say to you, so again, if you want to know what amen says, it's, that's an interesting discussion. But it says, I tell you the truth until heaven and earth pass away. Okay. And heaven and earth are not passed away yet. Okay. So you can't make the verse contradictory, so that Jesus says, until I fulfill all things, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of a letter will pass from the law, every jot and tittle, it actually literally says, because in Hebrew you have little jots and little tittles, which are like squiggles, which what they govern, the vowel or the, how to say the word. Just part of the system of writing. That if you ever dealt with Eastern patterns of writing, and there's lots of sort of annotations on the basic character, and that gives you the word, or it gives you the vowel, or it says, I tell you, it will pass away from the law until everything takes place. Then you've got verse 19, and it says, whoever then, so anyone who breaks one of the least of these commands, and it's very interesting actually there. I've just noticed I've got a number of different versions out, as well as the Greek on the page here. And it says, who, in the New American Standard, it actually says, whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments, and so teaches others, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever keeps and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And that annulling is that's quite powerful, isn't it? When you annul something, you you are saying this no longer applies. So this is really, they've done a good job there. The sort of like the New American Standard. They've captured part of the I think an important key to understanding this verse. And one of the best arguments, I think, to actually understand, because it's so idiomatic, because that verb's so general, you have to sort of like try and move that verse there. What does it mean to fulfill? And how can you translate that sort of like Matthew 5:17 to make it clear what it actually means? And for me, the best way of translating it is to say, let me get the verse up so that I'm as accurate as I can be. It says, think not that I have come to abolish or destroy the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. I think the best way of actually saying that is I have not come to abolish these things, but to demonstrate the correct application of the law. And what's my basis for saying that? That, he's trying to say, well, I've come to the correct application of this law. Well, what happens in the text afterwards? What is Matthew 5 and 6 and 7 famous for? Well, it's the Sermon on the Mount. And so Jesus is repeated as a pattern, repeatedly in these passages, following these verses where Jesus says, you've heard it said that, and you've heard it said that, but I say to you, but he is demonstrating the correct application of the law. So you can't make it contradictory by saying that Jesus is just talking about himself. I've come to fulfill, and therefore 2 years later after he says this, that suddenly it's all fulfilled and therefore the law doesn't apply anymore. That's the basic error, because he says until heaven and earth pass away, not one little jot or tittle of the law is going to pass away. You can't make it contradictory in that way. So, but he's saying here that what I'm teaching you and what the Holy Spirit will teach you through the life of the church is the correct application and the correct understanding of the law. Now, there are aspects of the law which were cultic aspects, which Paul is very, very clear on during the book of Galatians, is that stuff is a distraction. It will pull you away. You become legalistic. This is what they had to deal with in Acts, when the Pharisee converts were saying that even though the Gentiles have become converted, they still need to be circumcised. But Paul and Barnabas have to say, disagree, and they have to go to the elders in Jerusalem, and then you have you've got the record you haven't got the record of the details of the discussion, but you've got the high points where you've got it says after, I think is Acts 17. I think I'll put it down. I think it's or is it Acts 13? Wait a minute, let me try and find it, because this would be useful if I've got it. Yeah, here it is. It's Acts 15. It's talking about there, and it's talking So in Acts 15, it's all, you have this disagreement with the Pharisees who'd been converted, because some Pharisees were converted, and they were very legalistic, very much into the cult, and they said that Gentiles, when they're converted, have to be circumcised, but you have this, but Paul and Barnabas disagree strongly, so they have to go up to Jerusalem to the council of the elders, Peter and James and John, and you have the record of this discussion that happens there. And Peter says, you recognize that when the Gentiles heard, because, when he went to Cornelius's house, the Gentiles heard, and he said that they didn't need to be circumcised. Nothing needs to be happened. God just gave them the Holy Spirit. And before, without any of this happening, sorry, I'm just getting a bit hoarse here. So he is saying that God didn't, there was nothing, that in a sense, the circumcision of the New Testament believer, the circumcision itself has to be reinterpreted. And that's what Paul does. He talks about that our circumcision is a circumcision of the heart. It's an internal circumcision. What makes us, if you like, a spiritual Jew is the fact that our hearts are circumcised, that our circumcision is an internal one. Our covenant is an internal one, because the whole point of circumcision was that circumcision identified you as a covenant member of Israel. And so if you like, the circumcision that occurs on his heart, Paul reinterprets that. So there are aspects of, if you like, of the Hebrew scriptures and things that happen in scripture. There is a reinterpretation of some certain concepts. So in a sense, the promised land, instead of it being just the land of Israel, now Israel has a very important, significant part in the purposes and the plans of God. So it's of great significance in 1948 that the nation of Israel was reformed after nearly 2,000 years of not having their own nation. There is an enormous prophetic significance to that. And the Jews are still the chosen people of God, and they still have a covenant with God. But the church is also the people of God, and so the promises that are made to Israel are also promises that are made to the people of God, and anybody can enter into the if you like, the nation and the promised land of the church, of the promised land of the kingdom of God. So there are differences of how to understand these certain important terms, or we don't support sort of like a modern conquest of the land of Canaan or something, and go around. I mean, it's a problem for Israel at the moment because they're surrounded by hostile nations that have tried to destroy them. So they have to, it's very much. But there's no holy war. We don't sort of like commit genocide against because they were commanded to exterminate the Canaanites. Now people think, how could God ever endorse genocide of well, you have to. What you actually have to do is you have to find out what was the character of the Canaanites, and then you begin to understand why there was why there was a genocide that was ordered, if you like, to do, that is a different, very interesting, very controversial, very something that should be discussed, but it should be discussed in its own right. It's not part of this presentation, but just to say there is a difference. What I'm trying to say is that there's certain aspects or certain motifs, certain things that appear in the Hebrew or Hebrew scriptures where they have to be reinterpreted in sort of like in a Christian context, in a New Covenant context. But the basis of what, if you like, what a theonomical view would be arguing is that unless there is some explicit recension that God has made it very, very clear within, say, the Christian scriptures, that something in the Hebrew scriptures is no longer has to be reinterpreted or reapplied, and whatever's said in the Hebrew scriptures is still applicable and binding on the New Testament believer, or binding on the Christian, binding in the sense that it still applies. And that is the basic sort of like perspective. So there's no discontinuity. So when Paul talks about the end of the law, he's not talking about the end of the moral law or the end of the if you like, the legal and cultural principles that are outlined, and the agricultural principles, and the the artistic principles, the worship principles, all that sort of like stuff that's described in great detail and at great length in the Hebrew scriptures. It is still just as applicable for us at this time as Christian believers, and that's what is not appreciated, is that there's no this sudden discontinuity. Suddenly now the law's finished. It's the dispensation now of grace, and which it is a dispensation of grace. But the problem is that the old covenant was a great dispensation of grace as well. God chose a nation, and it's His grace that and the Messiah came, and then so they are really just trying to sort of like to get across this idea that there is dramatic change between, say, the practice of how the church has evangelized the world, and how the Jews were evangelizing. They were the Jews. And the interesting thing about the Jewish nation was that it was supposed to be like a beacon for all the nations, and all the nations were to come to Jerusalem and go to worship. And you see that in some of the prophetic passages. I think it may be in Amos, but it sort of like talks about, the church on the top of the hill and all the nations coming to the church, sort of coming to the nation, so coming to the nation of Israel, let's go up to the house of God, and all the nations go up together. And Jesus talks about that, doesn't he? In the, when he turned all the tables over in the temple, it says, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, all nations. So it's very much how that actually now gets fulfilled is, there is a big difference between, say, the character of the church as a multi-ethnic body, as a and the difference of a single nation of Israel, but the principles, the scriptural principles, and some of the practices and some of the detail that's there in the Hebrew scriptures is just as applicable for us here and now as it was for the nation of Israel. So there's difference, and there's separation, and there's discontinuity, but there's also very much a continuity between the old covenant and the new covenant. And I think that is the great, that was certainly for me, that was a real discovery, because I was very much, my early Christian experience was very much within the charismatic and Pentecostal, classical Pentecostal sort of environment, and the contrast between, say, the law, I'm not under law, we're under grace. That's very much part of that. It's very, very underappreciated, the place and the value of the law of God, because people were very, very reactive against, if you like, the legalism or the perceived legalism, at least, of what people can. And I think it was genuine, real legalism as well, of the what you might call the traditional evangelicals. And so the great reaction, this sort of like antinomian emphasis of the charismatic movement. But the problem is the antinomianism of that sort of like movement in many ways is one of the reasons why there's been so many scandals, or there's been so many, because people haven't understood the importance of actually understanding the place of the law of God and the value of the law of God, and how it speaks to, if you like, provide guardrails that stop people going completely nutty or falling into immorality, or, people who are talking about the fatherhood of God, and then they run off with their interns and stuff like this because they don't believe in a God of judgment anymore. The God's just this nice cuddly, we're sitting on the Father's knee and he's feeding us Holy Ghost gobstoppers or something. This very sort of feminized God as this big cuddly papa figure. People want to make the case that Abba means daddy. That big argument. In modern Hebrew, it does have that. In modern Hebrew idiom, a son or a daughter would call their father Abba. But that's something that's very much part of the modern idiom of Hebrew. Before, say, 600 AD or something, there's no evidence that Abba would meant anything else other than father, and a respectful term for father, because when Paul uses it in the scripture and says that we cry out Abba Father, what you've actually got is you've got the juxtaposition there of a translated Hebrew word Abba with the Greek term patra for. So so the very much the emphasis of that sort of like, I would say that the correct emphasis of that is to actually understand that God as the Father of all of all the different ethnic groups. You're not just talking about, it's not being particular to one or another. There's plenty of people, there's various Catholics and Protestants who've argued that case from a scholarly point of view as well, of trying to say that, Abba, it's incorrect to argue that Abba means daddy. Well, but I'll leave that for the man. That's a different, interesting, that's a very, very sort of like provocative term there. So I suppose if I'm sort of like trying to summarize there, I'm trying to say that our relationship as New Testament believers to the law of God is that unless God has because unless God has specifically said in the writings of has changed his law and indicated that there's some law has changed, then we must consider what's gone on in the Old Testament is still applying to us. One of the most interesting passages in this respect, I think, is where you find that discussion in Acts 15, where it says it sort of like concludes, and then Peter says something, and then James, who's the most, if you like, if you read the book of James, is one of the most Jewish of the Christians, but he actually says something, and he actually makes the point that let me try and say that he actually makes the point that he quotes, let me find this because this is useful. Yeah, here it says, when they finished, James spoke up. Brothers, listen to me. Simon, he's talking about Simon Peter, has described to us, or the apostle, what we could call the apostle Peter. Simon has described to us how at first God showed his concern by taking from the Gentiles a people for himself. The words of the prophet. So he's using a Jewish authority here because he's very much an apostle of the Jews and a Jewish apostle. He's saying the words of the prophets are in agreement with this, as it is written. After this, I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent. And then he says, its ruins I will build and restore it, that the remnant of men may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who bear my name, says the Lord, who does all these things. So this, even at this point here, you see, it's looking forward, and it's saying that that there's this link between what's going on in the new with the old, and we're all becoming. It's talking about, so even though this most Jewish of Jewish, and and Luther was so upset with the book of James that he just put it as an appendix. He says, because he talks about works and the working out of Luther's great insight was we're saved by grace and by faith in all, but not saved through works. And a surface reading of the book of James, almost says the opposite. I think there was a dispute going on between sort of like Paul and James in exchange, because James is using almost the exact same scriptures as Paul and giving a completely different interpretation and rendering of them. And it's only when we zoom back a little bit that we can actually appreciate the insight of both. Because James was very much talking about it from a pastoral perspective and a practical perspective of saying that our faith must mean something, doesn't he say? Because he said even the demons believe. But when we say that we have faith, it must work itself out in our actions. Whereas Paul's very much dealing with it from what you might say is an intellectual perspective, an objective perspective of being saved by grace through faith, and that was Luther's understanding. He understood that, and so very, very interesting looking at that there. But James is making this point that yes, the Gentiles are coming in. There is a Gentile expression. This is the new covenant. And so that linkage between the new and the old is really, really clear. And what's so interesting is that because Paul and Barnabas have gone, and James and Peter and the discussion of the elders have come up, but then they give them some advice, which is in itself, it's one of the most, people find it most one of the most perplexing. What's the significance of this? They find it a very perplexing sort of thing. They said, it's my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood. But Moses, and so you would think, so is that all that we have to do? Is that as long as we abstain from food polluted by idols, that we're sexually pure, from the meat of strangled animals and from blood, then that's all a new. So all the rest of the old Hebrew scriptures we can ignore, because the New Testament, the elders of the New Testament church have said this is all we should do. Well, that'll be all well and good, except for the next verse where it says, "For Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read on the synagogues on every Sabbath." So what they're actually saying here is not that you have to jettison and get rid of all that goes before, but that Moses has already been preached. And so people should understand that the law, when he's saying Moses here, this is an idiomatic use of Moses for the law and the prophets and everything in the Hebrew scriptures. And so it's not laying that aside, but it's actually saying that's all still relevant, but there are differences of application, and there are differences of how this stuff is worked out in the life of the New Testament believer. But all that stuff, there's other places where the Apostle Paul, I think he's talking, it's one of the most controversial aspects where he's talking about sort of like again, it's something that it's something that needs a study on its own. Maybe I'll get brave enough to do this one on my own as well, where he's talking about the role of women. And he gives a state, and then the end, the significant verse for the purposes of what I'm saying here is that he actually says, well, that is also what the law says. So you see, he's not laying aside the law. That's one of the things. The Apostle Paul is the one who's quoted most often, where he says it's not, we're not under law, we're under grace. The law came through Moses, but life and peace, grace and peace came through Jesus. So, and people tend to sort of like juxtaposition the two without actually understanding the law there has been used very technically in a very specific sense of the cult, and if you like, because you can just enumerate all the aspects of all the different instructions that were in the law, and you can just try and follow those mechanically without understanding what they're actually trying to say. And that's what makes the new covenant so different, in a sense, is that you're trying to get beyond just what is said to get to the principle. And that's why Paul elsewhere sort of like says that the fulfillment of the law is to love, because love is the fulfillment of the law. And when you can behave in love to one another, then you fulfill the law. So he's trying to say that how you can actually understand the law is by actually is that it's trying to say, when it says that, John sort of, John's very good on this, the Apostle John, because he talks about, that's one of his central themes, isn't it? Is the love of God and loving your brother and loving one another, and what the Hebrew scriptures were trying to do in all their detailed enumerations is to actually say, if you can actually get beyond those detailed enumerations, it's trying to say, well, love expresses itself in this way. If you work out in your life what love should be towards your neighbor, it's going to look like the enumeration within the Hebrew scriptures. But that heart, that spirit on the inside of us is what enables us to keep the law. So you actually have the grace to keep the law. So law and grace aren't in opposition to one another. They're actually, the grace allows you to actually fulfill what the law says. So we're never free from the Ten Commandments. We can never just say, we can never say adultery doesn't say become more acceptable or permissible for somebody in the new covenant, because it's not explicit, or bestiality or sleeping with animals. There's nothing in the New Testament about that, but that doesn't suddenly become acceptable to us on the basis of, say, a crude reading of Acts 15, where it says, these are the only few things, because he said right immediately afterwards, it says, for Moses has been preached in every city from the earliest times and is read in the synagogues on every Sabbath. So all those things are still important for us to actually understand, that God's not going to repeat something that he's already said. The interpretation might be different and it might be modified, but unless it's explicitly spoken in the Christian scriptures that something no longer applies to us or has been reinterpreted, there's a new sense to it. And some things are, like we say, the promised land it's interpreted differently. The people of God, it's interpreted differently. The Apostle Paul makes it very clear. And even when some of the interesting order is where he talks about, do not muzzle an ox when it's treading the grain. He says, do you think God's talking about oxen there? He's talking about, providing. He's very interesting, a very creative use of that scripture, I think. But he's talking about, workers in the gospel field of the world. So there is differences of interpretation, but the detail of what the law actually says for us is still relevant. And that's why, in a sense, where it becomes the most controversial aspect of that is what do you do with the penal sanctions, and where when people say, for example, somebody curses their father and their mother, and it says, it says the father and the mother have to testify against them, and the lazy son, the father and the mother, has to go to the elders of the town and actually says that our son's, a drunkard, he's lazy, he's cussing us out. And it says that they've got to be the first ones to throw a stone and they're put to death. So there's quite a lot of things where, where you're told to put to death, those who are there's all these sexual sins where people are put to death for, committing adultery with somebody else's, if two people are willing partners in adultery and they're married to other people, they're put to death. It's actually, you have to purge the wickedness from among you. And it actually says, this is the way you purge the iniquity and wickedness from among you. And also so that other people don't do the same. It's very interesting when I've been reading Deuteronomy, I've been noticing that this time where it says that one of the reasons why these punishments are so severe is it's supposed to be a deterrent it's supposed to be something that cleanses the land so that there's no wickedness within the land, so that the land is not defiled. That's another term that's repeatedly used, so that the land is not defiled. Because it talks about where there's the shedding of blood and how to resolve where there's been, people don't know, somebody's just been found dead and they've obviously been murdered in the field, and then they have to measure the distance to the nearest town, and then the elders of the town have to come out and there's a sacrifice made for the blood, and it says this is how the land is plowed and land is cleansed from its iniquity. And there's this great emphasis on the sanctity and the importance of preserving life, and the importance that people can't be put to death on just the testimony of one, but it has to be two or three. Everything is established by two or three. So there's all these different principles that are there in the law that are so useful for us. Now we look at the penal sanctions and we think, gosh, these are really severe, capital punishment for this, or when the basic principle is that if somebody sheds blood with malice or with intent, i.e. murder, then their life is required of them. And that's where it comes, and an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, where that people often misquote that and just say that, this is sort of like vengeful. It's not. It's meant to be like a principle where you're saying that if it's used at two different places within the law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and it's meant to be a limit that if somebody has accused somebody else of something and they intended them harm, then their punishment is what they intended to inflict on that other person by the means of their dishonesty. So if it was an eye, so they're saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth means that you can go that far, but you can't go no further. It's putting the bounds, because what would happen, you have to understand that the society and the culture of people was astonishingly violent. So somebody might You get this sort of impression, when you read, say, the early chapters of Genesis as well, when you've got it's one of Cain's descendants, and he sort of like said, you wives of whatever his name was, said, you wives of, Cain was killed, with one, and let me tell you that it's 7 times worse. I'll kill 7 men for even looking at me wrong. It was that brutal. And so you're dealing with this sort of this culture that's incredibly violent. So you could get sort of like the situation where, because there's mitigations put in the law, where if somebody accidentally kills somebody when they're sort of like working with an axe, they said they're allowed to flee to the city of refuge, so that the relatives of the person who was killed don't just kill them in the heat of the moment. So, we find that difficult because, obviously somebody's there, somebody's working with them. They get struck by an axe, they die. And we think, why would the relatives of somebody then go and kill the other guy? We find it difficult to understand a culture like that. But there's so much when you step back from it a little bit and you look and you can see how that needs to be, the usefulness of that there from the point of view of establishing sufficient kinds of evidence, wanting to preserve life, but nevertheless in cases where there's intent and there's killing with intent, which we would call murder, and there's no mitigating circumstances, then the life is required. So it's an eye for an eye, a tooth for tooth, a life for life. And so if you like, that's the precedent for capital punishment. And I think that's and it says that the purpose of that capital punishment is to cleanse the land. And, it's like, for me, capital punishment was, I don't think there's been any capital punishment in the UK, in practice since I think maybe it was just like and last one was maybe 1947, 48 or something like that. I think it actually was technically allowed for treason until about 2009, and then when we signed some European treaty, we had to delete that possibility of it even being there. But effectively, in line with most liberal democracies after the Second World War, the liberal politics at that time sort of like called the death penalty barbaric, but that it missed the point. That's the thing. The secularization of the culture missed the point. The point of capital punishment was not to undervalue life, but it was to say that life is so important that if the life of someone else is taken or their blood is shed, the only way that the land can be cleansed from that defilement is by the life of the person who took that life in malice. That's the only way that can be cleansed, and it's also the way of actually creating a deterrent from there, because people often say, oh, there's no deterrent. They come up with all these arguments regarding that it hasn't got any deterrent effect. Whereas if you look and say, and especially in sort of like in the Islamic world where it's brutal, some of the punishments are very brutal, and people cut people's hands off and legs off, and depending, but certain types of crime are extremely low because of the presence of punitive punishments. And so that's something, that a sociological argument that but from a spiritual point of view, there's a very, very strong mandate to if a life of somebody is taken maliciously, or if somebody is accused maliciously, then what they intended, if they killed somebody, their life is forfeit. If they stole or they concealed or they meant harm to the other person, then their punishment is that whatever harm they intended on that person would be done to them. So it's there's so much there. So even from the point of view of penal sanctions, I mean, this is where the big arguments, what people find so objectionable, is that type of how can we take, say, the penal sanctions that are there in the law and bring them into modern culture. Well, he can, and we should. No, it's not. I was very provoked. I can remember, in Skye, there's the Isle of Skye. There was a particularly unpleasant murder, a sexual assault and murder. What happened was that a young girl, I think she was 12 or 13, I think her dad or something was some sort of petty drug dealer, just a cannabis dealer. And one of the friends of the family, or acquaintances, or somebody, I think, of the family had come, and they had basically raped and killed this girl. He'd obviously come to buy some drugs or something, but he then raped and killed the girl, and he then flee. And for me, that's premeditated murder, and I don't think there's anything wrong whatsoever that person should have been put to death. They shouldn't be in prison for 20, 30 years even. They might, to be honest, even get out within 10 on good behaviour, and but they shouldn't. People who have murdered with intent shouldn't be able. Their lives should be forfeit. I don't think there's any, and that's a perfect example of a case where there is no reason whatsoever. There's nothing civilized about allowing such a person to live. So, that's when what's in the Hebrew scriptures can be so informative for us as a culture, as believers, because we can look and say, what did God say? Because there's explicit cases where he actually talks about, again, you read this in Deuteronomy so many times, where he says, this situation you are to show no mercy or no pity to, and some of it was like really brutal, I think it's one I read this morning. This is an unusual one, but it sort of like says that if two guys are having a fight and the wife of one of them grabs the guy's genitals of, who's attacking her husband, then it says you are to cut off her hand and you are to show her no pity or no mercy. And you might think, but the thing is, the point is to look beyond just the actual punishment. It's to actually say, what is that saying? Because that is the procreative function. So God is actually making the point about life and the importance of life. We want to get into the details of, oh gosh, how brutal is that but it actually talks about, and it says there are cases where it says, even though it might seem so harsh, it's what it's actually saying and what it's meant to be saying to us as a culture, because we can be so numb and so insensitive to what's important to God. If God said something about something, then that should be a corrective to what's going on. The word of God is final authority in our life. And so I hope that, that's just, if you've never heard anything about theonomy before, this might be like that. That's probably like the equivalent of what I've just said in the last, I should imagine it's probably about an hour, isn't it? What I've sort of like said in the last hour might be completely new to you. So I'll put, I'll put links to sort of like to my thesis, because there's plenty in there, in my master's thesis, plenty there in about sort of like about theonomy, but also I'll upload some of Greg's series on theonomy, where he talks about the issues and he talks about some of the criticisms, because there was all sorts of criticisms, but I'll put, a link to his book as well. Because it's one of the real keys to how we can move from this insipid sort of spiritual, if you like, enlightenment idea that religion is something private, very, very private, and it's something that's very evangelical, that my Christian faith is a very personal and private matter. And yes, it is very personal and private. There's that dimension, but it should have implications for the whole of society and the whole of your life. The whole point of it being on the inside of you is that you are, it says, Jesus talks about that, doesn't he? Say, you're supposed to be a lamp on shining and giving your light out. The leaven is supposed to be through all the dough. It's not just a personal and private matter. It's supposed to be affecting the whole of culture. We're supposed to be an advert. We're the fragrance in other places. Isn't it? Paul says we're the fragrance of life to those that are being saved, and the fragrance of death to those. In other words, we should really provoke the people that, when we're a fragrance of death, it's like we should be really provoking them, but we should be really an absolute blessing for those just because of the way we are. Okay, so I will have a pause here. I think I would love to talk about tithing, but I don't think I'm going to have time, and I got a little bit hoarse as well. But I will put all this stuff in this, because there's so much content here, and I think it was just worthwhile, introducing the idea of theonomy. What is our relationship to the old covenant? Is it binding on the new? Because in many ways, when we then talk about tithing, we can see that yes, there's this continuity here. So it's just because there's not much talked explicitly about tithing in the New Testament, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Christian scriptures. There's no sections, where it talks explicitly about tithing, but the fact that there are in the Old Covenant in the Hebrew scriptures, that has never been rescinded. There's nothing, there's nothing that says that this doesn't apply anymore. That should help us to actually understand that there's a real strong scriptural case for that. Is that everything in the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures is just as applicable for us now today in our ethics and in our spiritual practices, unless there's been some explicit reinterpretation or reapplication in the new for the new covenant believer. So if you like, the cultic aspects of Judaism, that's what we're free from. That's what Paul says. We're not circumcised. We don't have to follow the Jewish festivals. We don't have to follow the Jewish how they had to wear, or to have little tassels on their garments and have tassels on the side of their head, like you see Orthodox Jews today, don't you? Some of the Hasidic Jews today still, have these outward pictures of something that should be something that's happened on the inside of us. So that's what we're free from. But we're not free from the moral requirements, which are headlined in the Ten Commandments, but they're then applied practically and sociologically and subjectively and politically and culturally. That's what those purposes of those books are, of Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. They're very, very practical. And then the narratives that when you go through Chronicles and the prophets, and they're all about culture and society as a whole. God's idea of a just culture and a just society doesn't suddenly get completely turned on its head and it's all irrelevant when you come into the New Covenant age. No, it's always relevant. That's why that stuff is there. It's meant to be a blueprint for us in this time. I mean, Landa Cope, who's one of the founders of YWAMs, one of her books, again, all this stuff is in my master's thesis. I will put a link here and in the bibliography. The bibliography is very, very detailed. But one of her books was she calls it the Old Testament template for nations. And this is supposed to be telling us how to structure our society. It's not saying that, these societies aren't different and they're culturally distinct, and we have emphasis and we have ways of looking and we have things that we like, and, but there's the core of it, if you like, the moral core of a culture is something that should be drawn from scripture, So I hope that is, I hope that's been stimulating. I know it's sort of like been quite rapid fire and I've said lots of things, but you can understand, once you understand that, how Matthew 5, 17, 18 and 19 is exegeted and exposited in the following chapters, in this what's called the Sermon on the Mount, then you can understand that all these erroneous interpretations of what that word fulfill means, it becomes clear, because Jesus is saying that, I'm giving you the proper interpretation of the law. The law never passes away, but I'm giving you the proper interpretation to it. So if there's one thing I want you to get, it's that, is to actually understand that Jesus has said, I'm not come to get rid of the law, and the fulfillment of the law, in order to actually understand, that generic verb better, it's better translated as, I've come to demonstrate to you the proper application of the law. And that's what you get in the Sermon on the Mount. And that's why in other places, when, both John and the Apostle Paul both say that, love is the fulfillment of the law. Paul's great passage in 1 Corinthians 13, where he talks about love, and that, faith works through love, through the instrument of love, by the means of love. And John talks about love. We love one another, love a brother. Somebody who doesn't love his brother or hates his brother, but says he loves God, is a liar. And, it's very, very obvious, that love is the fulfillment of, and love to our neighbor. What does love your neighbor mean? Well, that's why you've got all these extra details in the extra narrative to find out what loving your neighbor is, and it's very practical things, and there was a Jewish context for the nation of Israel, particular to Jewish context, but there's principles which are universally applicable in every culture and at every time, in every era. Okay, so God bless you, and I will talk about tithing whenever I've got a next chance. Maybe it'll be this Sunday, actually, because it's sort of like it's Thursday today. Friday I have to, it's a long work day. Saturday, housework day, and shopping day, and wood day, and cleaning day, and Sunday, hopefully, I'll get onto the tithing, because I'm quite, I think maybe the tithing one will be shorter, but because I've covered so much ground here today. But, tithing is there's so much misunderstanding and nonsense spoken about tithing, and people who are offended and upset with tithing because they've never understood what tithing is, and that it's all dodgy preachers and terrible practices of churches that have just basically extracted money out of people, and it's been like a tax. But actually understanding what tithing is, and that it's an act of worship, and it's an act of voluntary worship, but it is a principle that has a reward. It is an action that has a reward, and God promises a reward for the tither, and the tither, the one who tithes, has access to the power of God and the blessing of God in their life. There's an access to, if you like, the enabling power. It releases the power of God for somebody in their life. So there's the subjective and the objective aspects of it. There's the, if you like, the requirement, if you like, and I'm using the word require there in a specific sense, as a requirement to tithe, but there's also the benefits and the blessing of tithing. So I absolutely believe that tithing is for today, and tithing is an important principle, but it has to be understood within the wider context of the new covenant believer, but also actually understanding of why the argument that tithing is passed away because it's something of the law, and therefore it doesn't apply to us as believers today. I hope I've already said enough to say that that's an invalid argument, just on the basis that the law hasn't passed away. The law is still applicable, but that's very, very common idea. But there's with tithing, there's a much stronger spiritual explanation and spiritual description of tithing that you can understand that it's an action that predates the law. There's an expression of it within the law, and then there's an expression of it, if you like, post in scare quotes the law. So that's just as applicable for believers. Okay, I think that's my wife just arrived back, so I'll have to stop now. God bless you. See you again. Hi, Dr. Michael McNeil here. I finally managed to get around to this video. I've been really looking forward to doing this one. I've done two. The series that I was doing, it was the law, the prophets, and tithing. And in the previous two, I've established, I believe, beyond reasonable doubt, that the first important point is that we're not sort of like exempt from the requirements of the law, other than the ceremonial aspects of the law. We're not called to. Some people, I was thinking about this earlier on, some people sort of try and become Jews, they become Christians, and then they realise, the importance of the law, and then they start dressing up as Jews, and they're a bit strange, and they go weird and have prayer shawls and all that stuff, and that's where it's nonsense. I haven't mentioned that previously, so I thought that was a good addendum to the previous two. We're not called as Gentiles. We become believers, and then suddenly we become Jews, and we're called to become sort of like culturally, what Orthodox Jews do today. I mean, that's missing the point entirely. But there are strange people that do that, and go around getting prayer shawls and start dressing up and tassels and all that. That's just nonsense. That's what we can say, that because all those aspects of the law to do with your clothes and to do with that's what you'd call the cultic aspects of of the cult of Jewishness, sort of like is that what the ancient Israelis and the ancient Jews, how they practiced their religion. That's the stuff. They are all prefigured, and their completion was in Christ, and so so there's no need for us to go weird and go strange. People tend to sort of oscillate a little bit between the two extremes. So they reject, they'll reject the entirety of the law, and won't have any of them become antinomians. And then there's other people who realise that the law is important, and then they suddenly start getting around. They realise that the Jews are significant, and the prophetic, they're God's prophetic time clock. And then they'll start sort of like trying to become sort of like Jews, and listening to lots of Jewish folk music, and start doing things which are just Jewish custom. They just which have no significance for us. They don't make us any more spiritual, or they start going off to sort of feasts, and there's nothing wrong with sort of like going to a Passover meal, but the Passover meal was it signifies the Son of God on the cross, and the body being broken, and that you take one bit of bread here, you take another bread, then you take the second bit and you break it, and and that was that, and so that is all fulfilled. And so that aspect of the law, it says Christ is the end of the law. That's what the Apostle Paul said, didn't he? He said that Christ is the end of the law with regards to that bit. So those cultic aspects of the law are complete. They're gone. They have no significance for us. Now, what we are redeemed from the curse of the law, this is in a sense is all revision from a previous video. So if you want this in more detail, but the aspect of the law that we're not sort of just that is still applicable to us is the, if you like, the moral aspects of the law. So something like adultery or doesn't become any more acceptable for us pre-Jesus than after Jesus. So Christ doesn't redeem us from it's just a symbol after the law, after the crucifixion, and after Jesus coming, as it was prior to him coming. So these moral requirements of the law is the parts of the law which are eternal. We're always judged by the law, and we keep the law in some respects. In some aspects of the law, we keep the law in Jesus, because we're grafted into with the body of Christ, and so he has kept some aspects of the law from us, but in the very practical sort of sense of what I call theonomical ethics, theonomy and Christian ethics. Our ethical the ethical guide for us is found within the Hebrew scriptures, and unless the theonomical principle is that unless those requirements of the law has been specifically revised in the Christian scriptures, they're just as binding for us as they were for the Hebrews. So yeah, that doesn't mean there aren't. There's been some very significant changes. After all, it's called the New Covenant. It says the Spirit comes to live within us. We have we have the Spirit that, and when we hear the word, we respond to it spiritually. We have that great advantage in a sense over the Hebrews, because it said the Spirit of God would come upon people for a specific task, or they would have some sort of relationship with the Spirit, but there would also be external things like the umin and thummim, and the priest would be, it's like they would be casting lots, and for us it's much more precise. The Spirit comes and dwells within us, but it's the I think it's in Romans where Paul talks about, Romans 8 I think, where he talks about, it says that the righteous requirement of the law are fulfilled in us who walk by the Spirit and not by the letter of the law. Because where people go awry with the law is when they start trying to be mechanical about it, and they start considering it just as a what people might say a series of religious actions. They've turned it back into a cult rather than it being a living body of moral knowledge that we're interacting with in both an objective and a subjective way. It suddenly just becomes a list of things that we should do. And so, but I think the point's well made nevertheless, that we're not redeemed from the requirements of the law, which are moral requirements. They're eternal requirements. And so the bit that I want to get on there, so I've discussed sort of like basically our general relationship with the law, and why we distinguish why was there law and prophets. The prophets were a later iteration in the life of the Jews, and so Jesus would normally refer to the law and the prophets, but other times people refer to the law as that whole body of the Hebrew scriptures. There's technical, non-technical, precise, imprecise use of the same term, but the law for us, and the law and the prophets, is emphasizing the fact that it's the entire Hebrew scriptures which are relevant. Now the part which I think is the most controversial, this is where people start spewing out green seconds. Their heads start spinning on poles, and they get very, very offended at this particular subject. And this is the subject of tithing. And I think it's because there's been so much abuse of tithing within, say, the life of believers, and there's been so much legalism connected to it, and misunderstanding around the subject, that it provokes some very, very strong reactions. And I've got, I've already testified, I think, in previous videos of my wife's own experience, as bringing up, being in a church where they were very, where she reacts against some of the stuff there, being a single mum with 3 children, and you would think that she had quite a bad sort of like experience where sometimes she just couldn't help people, or in other cases where where people have basically said that if you're not going to tithe and give your 1/10 of your income gross, then you can't be a member of this church. You're robbing God. That the robbing God thing actually comes from Malachi. I think I've got it queued up. Where's Malachi? If not, I should have it queued up. Let's get Malachi. Yeah, Malachi. This is probably the one that's used most to perhaps bash people, but it's got a great promise. We should understand this one. But it says here, bring the whole tithe, and a tithe, just to make a point, is just a 1/10. It's very, even in the Hebrew or the Greek, if you want to look at this, if you want to look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which predates, what people call the Hebrew Masoretic text by 1,000 years or something. You can still see, it's the Greek of Alexander the Great. It was around, it came because the Greeks, became the dominant world power. So, the Hebrew scriptures were translated very early on into Greek. And the interesting thing is that in the Gospels, especially in the book of Luke, it's actually Septuagint which is actually quoted, because there is some variation between, say, what would be the Hebrew and the Septuagint, and so and it's actually Septuagint, which is very interesting. The Greek is the one that's actually being quoted there, so they were a multilingual community. So, but it's very, very simple. When it says bring the whole tithe, it just means a tenth. Okay, so there's no, there's nothing unusual about that word, and in the Greek, it's it just talks about, it in some places it's decta, which obviously is a tenth. You can see decadon. It's where we get the name for a 10-sided figure, and in other places it is interesting. It's more of a figurative sort of word that's used, and in Malachi it's actually that. It's actually Acropia or Acroia. Again, my it would be interesting how that translation is. Exoria, I think, maybe. And that's, again, you'll have to excuse me, it's Erasmian pronunciation. I think it's Exoria there, and that's sort of giving the translation as payment on produce, rent, tithe. Again, and it's also something that's found in a long history within the literature itself, not just in scriptures, but in the Hebrew and the Greek literature. It's got a long history of those words, so we know that that's all they mean. They just mean a tenth. And for the Hebrews generally, their tithe was of agricultural produce, or if it was cattle, it was cattle. But even within the Hebrew scriptures themselves as well, it says that the tithe could be converted into money, because what they were supposed to do with the tithe, this is the interesting thing of what they were supposed to do with the tithe, was they were supposed to bring it to a central place where the Lord actually says. And so for them it was like coming up to Jerusalem, and it was meant to be like a festival where people would actually come together. They'd bring their tithe, they'd bring all their servants, all the proselytes, all the converts would be converted to Judaism. Everybody was supposed to gather on the year of the tithing, which was the third year, and then they would just have this big party. And so this money wasn't necessarily just going to, they were bringing it up to the temple, but it was then used as part of this big festival. So just sometimes you get the impression that it was very legalistic. It was just given to sort of like to the level, to the central priest, and that was it. There was nothing else. It was just a matter of the offering. But on this year of the tithing, which was the third year, there was a regular tithing where people would tithe from their produce, and they would off give their. But there was also this special third year of the tithing, and I think that one. Now, a lot of this is in Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy. If you want to reference it, it's Deuteronomy 12, Deuteronomy chapter 12, and chapter 14. There's a lot in there. Chapter 26. So those chapters, and you'll see all these sort of like differences in sort of. So tithing's not just one thing, and I think that's where people again they can stumble a little bit. And one thing I think we need to deal with sort of like straight away before I go off too much into the detail is that people often will object to tithing and say, well, tithing's under the law, and we're Christ is the end of the law, and therefore we don't have anything to do with tithing. We don't need to tithe. Now that is just bad. That's just mistaken. That's just incorrect. The first time we actually see an example of tithing directly in Scripture, now you can argue that whenever this is worth exploring slightly, because one of the principles connected with tithing is where all these scriptures you read about tithing, whether it's in the Deuteronomy chapters 2, 12, 14, 26, they are seen first in Leviticus, but Deuteronomy is like the second. All Deuteronomy means is it's like the second statement of the law. So it's clear in Deuteronomy, because in Leviticus it was the first giving of the law, and the second they just they wandered around in the desert for 40 years because they'd been disobedient, and then Moses was repeating it. And so Deuteronomy gives you, I like the statement in Deuteronomy. It's clearer in some ways, I think, than in Leviticus. But it's the same. It's a restatement of the first things. That's why you can compare the two. But they're giving the how tithing is interpreted within the law. But tithing was something that happened prior to the law. So the point I was going to just remember that my thought process went off slightly. But where you'll see repeatedly, and there's a pattern where when the Israelites are sort of like coming into the land, the first time they came into the land, it says the first city that you conquer, the entire everything. It uses the term dedicated to the Lord, which basically means that everything is completely all the wealth of the city, everything it was just complete. It was razed to the ground. It was totally destroyed. All the plunder, which had been the gold, the silver, everything, it was just completely. The whole place was just completely obliterated. Some people get offended at that, but it was totally, completely obliterated. None of the women, the children, everything. It was just, the first place that they went to, the first one, as soon as they were crossing over, the first, there was all the subsequent cities that were taken over. People could take plunder from. They could take cattle. They could take, wives. We think of it as pretty brutal, but they could take wives and the women. They would normally have to kill all the men, which. We can go into, people obviously think, gosh, this is like genocide, what's going on. But again, I mentioned there's reasons for this, and there's reasons why, why in the sense the Canaanites there was a reason why they were, God said these people are so wicked, and you can go into seeing the stuff in Genesis, and you can see all the mention of the Nephilim and the giants and everything. This was like corrupted human seed. This was human seeds mixed with the demonic. So there's all sorts of reasons why the Canaanites were known for their cruelty. So there's all sorts of reasons why there was like this holy war to wipe them out. And the interesting thing is as well is that when you read, just to make that point, when you read about the Anakites or the giants, there's the Anakites, the Rephaim, the Nephilim, all these sort of human and demon hybrids, which is when you also realise that it uses sort of like the phrase sometimes within the scriptures where it says even for people who weren't, for tribes that weren't Jewish, it says that God allowed he went before them. Maybe it says that he went before the Moabites who settled in that area, and he drove out the Anakim from before them. So it wasn't just something that was specifically to do with the Jews getting rid of these, they're getting rid of these beings. It was the other non-Jewish peoples as well. It says that the Lord explicitly drove these people out. But the Canaanites were known for their brutality, for their the level of sexual perversion, and I know people have done sort of like these archaeological digs and stuff, and when they were finding sort of like different Canaanite settlements, and it's really quite disturbing what they found. And I think somebody told me something like 90% of the stuff that they've actually found, they don't put on display to the public. And I can remember listening to one presentation where the guy says where it was so disturbing, some of the things that they were finding, that were revealing in their practices, that he said it was quite traumatizing for for the archaeologists. So there is reasons. So before people just sort of like look and say, oh gosh, this it's so brutal, this Old Testament, or well, the world was brutal. It took Jesus actually coming to change the world, but it was brutal. And the whole culture, this culture that the ancient Israelites were in, was a brutal culture. And this is what's so interesting in the sense about this sort of early history in these early sort of books of Moses. Here is God, and I mentioned this again in one of the previous videos in this series. So I listened to them today just to remind myself, because it was a couple of weeks ago when I did those. But it's one of the points I made. It was very much to do with God was taking these people who are basically slaves with a slave mentality and saying, right, this is how you run a nation. And so coming back to the point regarding tithing, so whenever they went into a particular, whenever it was the first time, or the first thing, or the first, like talk about the first harvest, or the first time you sort of go, there was always something that it says is dedicated to the Lord, which basically meant the first of whatever they were doing, they dedicated to the Lord. So the firstborn, and it says the firstborn belonged to the Lord, but you were able to redeem your firstborn. So and the way in a sense, you were, instead of you giving your firstborn to the Lord, which is like basically means that you're going to offer a sacrifice. You pay, you make some sort of offering. That it was redemption. That was what it was called. It was called redeeming the firstborn. So and it would often be sort of, especially in later times, it was financial. So people would give a certain amount of money, or they'd give it if it was a sort of like agrarian or cattle or whatever it was an equivalent value. Because even there, I mentioned this sort of like just earlier on in the presentation, even when in the first giving of the law, it says that if you were too far away, if you were a tribe that was too far away from Jerusalem, you would convert the equivalent into a monetary equivalent, and then you come to where the festival was, and then you would convert it back into produce, and then you would give your offering. So it's very, excuse me, oh gosh, excuse me, I might have to edit that out. But so there was this sort of like equivalent of, there's nothing unusual about the tithe. It can be, it was literally just a tenth, whether it's monetary or produce or cattle, whatever it was. So we got this idea of it being first. So whenever the Israelites did anything, always the first time it was something new, there was always something, this phrase, you see it repeatedly in the scriptures, dedicated to the Lord. And you also see it in sort of like reflected in the Christian scriptures as well. You get sort of like Paul says, the first thing you do at the beginning of the week, right? If we're going to, because there was a famine, and in I think it's in 1 Corinthians 15, I think, where he talks about the doing a collection. So right, the first thing you do in the week is do a collection for the saints who are in need. So there's something about it being first, and having at the front of your consciousness an appreciation, and that's something you see in the tithing as well, isn't it? If you go through those in Deuteronomy, it's trying to teach them appreciation and acknowledgement to God, that this is what we've got from God. You read that very much in Deuteronomy 26. They said you're coming up to the priest, you're making this confession, and it's saying we were wandering slaves, and my ancestor was a wandering Aramean, but Lord, you've come and you've brought me out, and you've blessed us, and here is a produce, and here is the blessing for you. So it's not so much the form of those words that they needed to do. The Lord was trying to teach them about appreciation, and you see that in, I think, repeatedly if you look for the tithing scriptures. It's about appreciation. It's about teaching the people appreciation for the goodness, and the things that have come to the increase in their life. And that's how we should, in a sense, understand like Malachi. So where it says, bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, Malachi 3:10 it says. so that there might be food in my house. And test me now in this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until it overflows. So this is probably the tithing scripture most people sort of know most about. But I want to, before we dig too much into that, I want to sort of like deal with this issue, already, of whether tithing is within the law. If it was in the law, therefore we're redeemed from it in Jesus, and that I'm saying is incorrect. I've sort of filled in a lot of other gaps there before getting to this point. But the tithe was just first. Conceptually, it's always first. But tithe, so an argument could be made that in the earliest narrative we've got in Genesis about man being in the garden and the Lord saying to him, it says, do not eat of the fruit of this tree, the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. In a sense, it's the moral sense. Now, an argument could be made there that tree was a tithe, but that I think is an inference. I think it's okay. I personally am okay with that. That it's but the first explicit example of tithing is with the example of Abraham giving a tenth of all the spoils of his battle to Melchizedek. And so before I launch into that, I'm going to just have a short break. But that is the first example of what I would say is for us is of an explicit mention of tithing. And what you immediately notice is that what you should notice, and this is the thought I'm going to leave you with, is that predates the Mosaic law. So the tithing is a spiritual principle that has predated the law, and if we understand that, then we can get past all these ridiculous, prejudicial, extreme reactions to tithing, and of people saying that it's within the law. Because I don't think I've seen anybody objecting to the tithe that doesn't try to make that connection that it's underneath the law, and Christ has fulfilled the law for us, therefore we're not obligated. I've already said on 2 measures I think that's a mistake. We're still obligated to the moral aspects of the law. It's the cultic law, but if we're going to argue that tithing is within the cultic aspect of the law, I would say that that's incorrect also, because Abraham tithed. So I'm just going to have a brief break and I'll be back. Hello, Dr. Michael McLean here again. A short break there. So the thought I left you with was that tithing is a spiritual principle. It's something that predates the law. So when Abraham came to Melchizedek after the defeat of the kings, if you know that when he went to rescue Lot, and it was the kings of Sodom came to him, and they said keep the people. And Abraham made an amazing confession. He said, I'll not take anything, but just let the people, young men that gave it, but I don't even want a shoelace out of your shoe. So I don't want you saying that you made Abraham rich. So because Abraham was basically going to rescue his nephew, but it said that the king of Salem, or which was the original name for Jerusalem, came out with the bread and the wine, which is also interesting, symbols of a covenant. And who this Melchizedek is. Paul plays on this, who Melchizedek is in the New Testament. Some people used to call it a Christophany, which is like an appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament. Now, I think that's stretching it too far. I think he was symbolic of Jesus. He prefigured sort of Jesus in some way, but because it says that in Melchizedek they couldn't find his genealogy, he seemed to be without male, and Paul uses that as a type of saying here's the figure of Jesus. He uses that very well in the book of Hebrews, a piece, masterful exposition Hebrews. But the point is, and the main point I want you to understand, because this then deals with, I think, as far as I know, this deals with just about everybody's objection to tithing, is the fact that tithing is a spiritual principle which predates the law. Now, within the law, it has a very detailed elaboration. So within the Jewish cult, there's lots. It's like I say, you've got Deuteronomy. In fact, you've got Leviticus 27:30, 27:31. I'm just reading from my list here. Numbers 18:20, 18:24. So chapter 8, so Numbers 18 has got stuff in. So Leviticus 27's got stuff about tithing. Numbers 18's got stuff about tithing. Deuteronomy chapter 12 and 14 has got stuff about tithing. Deuteronomy 26 has got stuff about tithing. And what's interesting is that when you get out, so that, if you like, that's the formal statement of the tithing, how tithing was practiced within the law. And then you've got an interesting sort of like accounts of it in, say, Nehemiah, where that's a time of national reformation. That's a time of the nation, like I suppose you could say what's actually happening in the US at the moment with sort of Trump 2, Trump 2.0. They're having a major, he's pulling apart this rotten government and trying to remake it and trying to get rid of the corruption. And the book of Nehemiah is very much like a type, it's like an archetype of that, of how a nation is reformed. You can see a lot of parallels going on between what's been going on in Trump 2 and in Nehemiah, and because the character of Nehemiah as a political leader, that guy was strong and mean. It's like he wasn't somebody to be messed with. And so it's worth reading Nehemiah if you've never read Nehemiah, because he was a guy who was a political animal. He really was somebody who was amazingly strong, very, very influential. And then it's interesting because Nehemiah and Ezra, you had Nehemiah who was the political figure, Ezra who was the priest, and they worked together. They were different, and they're different. Nehemiah was the one that was dealing with all the mechanics and organising people and organising the army, and Ezra then taught the people. They're very I think in the Hebrew scriptures, and they're actually in the same scroll. They're actually connected with, as in physical, they're written together. But in the way the scripture is written, so like in the especially in the English Bibles, they're separated into two different books. But there's overlaps in the books. There's the same event recorded, once by Ezra and once by Nehemiah, which in itself is helps build up the cases as an accurate representation of actually what went on. So, but you read that when during a time of national reformation, people actually brought tithes and stuff they hadn't been doing for hundreds of years. There was always this other tithe was meant to be an indication of appreciation and to the Lord. So the principle that's central, if you like, central to tithing, you've got this enormous, elaborate sort of expression of tithing within the law, because the law is elaborate, isn't it? This is about how to run a nation, but you've got predate. So if you just get back to what Abraham was doing to Melchizedek. Abraham was a mighty prince. It says that he was referred to by other people who were living in the way the society was structured in that way is that you had people it said it was king. It often talks about kings, but king was somebody. A king would be like the mayor of the town, or and they might extend their influence out, and so Abraham was considered like one of this. You get this impression of, Abraham was very much more nomadic in the sense that they had lots of cattle, so they would follow grazing, they'd move, and so. But he was other when he was made deals with other people who were living in the land. When he bought the cave for the Hittite to bury his dead, he says, "Sir, the guy talks to him and says, 'Sir, you're a mighty prince amongst us.'" He was somebody of great influence, and he had a personal army of 200-300 people with it, and so it was like he was very, he was a very influential person, but it says that after this battle, where he they defeated these other kings, and the king of Sodom and stuff comes to congratulate him, thank him, and say, because he'd been fighting against this these alliances that formed, and he just wanted to sort of to get stuff back, and Abraham says to him, you can just take what you like. I don't want to be accused that you gave me anything. But it says that Abraham took from the spoils of the battle. It says that he took a tenth. When the king of Salem, when Melchizedek came out, it says Abraham took a tenth of all he had and gave it to Melchizedek. And so it was an acknowledgement, it was a deferment. So this Melchizedek, and Paul makes this big case for this in the book of Hebrews. It says that there's always there was this upward progression. You're giving upwards. Your tithe is going upwards. You're honouring God in your tithe, and so the Abraham giving to Melchizedek just shows how great this figure Melchizedek was. And so this Melchizedek, it was God of the most high God. And so that's an old, that was an ancient reference to Elohim, to the God who revealed himself as the I am to the Israelites. But there was obviously some revelation of him, because it talks in the early chapters of, I think, by about Genesis 7, it says that people started to call on the Lord. So God was still moving amongst humanity, even in these ancient times, long before there was an Israel. So there was obviously this practice of tithing, of giving a tenth of what you had to your God, was well established within lots of cultures, not just the ancient culture or the Jewish culture or the expression of tithing in the law. It was something that's throughout the ancient history. It wasn't an unusual thing, and it was always the giving of the lesser. It was an honor. It was honoring your deity. It was it's central to the idea of the tithe is acknowledgement and the thankfulness and giving honor. And so that's the spiritual aspect of it. There's an enormous elaborate expression of it in the law, but this is why Malachi is useful, because Malachi, when you understand sort of like Malachi and when Malachi was actually written, Malachi was written it is actually historically the last book that was written, and there was like this 500-year period, say 500 BC to the time of Jesus, when it seemed like God stopped speaking, and the revelation of God to the Jews, it seemed like it was a time where it seemed like there was an absolute famine in the word of the Lord. That's an expression that's used in some of the other prophets. It says there's a time coming where there's this great famine of the word of the Lord, and in a sense it was the time it's almost like it was the preamble to the time before the coming of Jesus, where it says that the Lord looked on the first covenant. It talks about this in Jeremiah, doesn't it? Sort of like the Lord looked on the first covenant and it said, and was dissatisfied. The book of Hebrews, Paul brings this out in his exposition. That's why, if you never read Hebrews, read Hebrews. It's an amazing book, but it talks about that God calls the first covenant old because it's just about, and it's going to pass away, and he was dissatisfied with it. And so this interim period, this sort of 500 years, was the time when there was all these political struggles going on, and there was all the time of the Maccabees and all this political intrigue and everything, and the cult was dying. The Jewish cult was dying, and you got the emergence of the if you like, the liberals who were the Sadducees, and the conservatives who were the Pharisees, and you had this complete, what was supposed to be the Levites and the priesthood was corrupt and taken over. So, but you have this period. Malachi was written just at this time, and so one of the aspects you can see is that people had stopped responding to God in the way that he wanted them to respond. They'd stopped acknowledging God. In one place he says, if I'm a father, where is my honour? If I'm a, he goes in, he said this person here, this earthly father, has honour. If I'm a father, how much more honour should I have? It's an a fortiori argument where it's coming from the lesser to the greater. He's saying, if this person's a father, he has honour. And now I'm a father, I'm a much greater father, where is my honour? And so that's the context in the sense of how Malachi 3:10 should be understood. It's reminding people of what happened out, of what they've stopped doing. And this is why in the time of Reformation, in the time of Nehemiah, you see the tithing had restarted. But tithing was always there as an expression of thanks and acknowledging God in your life and the blessing of God. That's what Deuteronomy was trying to teach people about tithing, was that this is acknowledging, this is giving acknowledgement to God and thankfulness to God. Now it was also teaching people about charity and supporting family members and refugees who had come into, who decided they wanted to they joined themselves to the Jewish nation. In our time it's more problematic because we tend to think of people just come in and they keep their own culture. And that's not what the foreigner. That's not what it meant when it says, "Don't forget the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner amongst you." The foreigners who were amongst you were people who'd actually decided they want to become part of the Jewish nation and they wanted to adopt the Jewish culture. So that's why when people, just a little bit side teaching, when people try to use these scriptures to say, remember you were a foreigner and a slave in Egypt, and they try to use these scriptures to say, right, that's why we're supposed to not have borders and just welcome everybody in. That's just a misunderstanding of it, because it was people who had decided to become part of the Jewish nation, and there was even space for people who had decided they just wanted to live amongst the Jewish nation. Nobody was forced to be converted to adopt the Jewish religion, but what they weren't allowed to do was to build temples to their previous God. So if they were coming to live within the Jewish nation, even though they weren't required to convert, they also weren't able to give a public expression to their own religion. They were at least having to come into the culture enough that they would respect the customs and respect the people they'd come to live around. So that in itself is maybe we should do an in-depth study on that at some point, because that is needed, because of we saw that, didn't we? We saw that at the inauguration of Trump, and them going to the Episcopalian bishopess who criticised them all and talked about it. It's just a total misunderstanding of immigration and borders and the moral obligations that you have to refugees and to foreigners, and I think that is something that is worthwhile. I think I'll try and be a bit more formal about that, but I thought it was worth mentioning now within this context. Because when it talks about, doesn't it? It talks about in one of the tithings, which says, all the foreigners that are with you and the people that come to live with you and your servants, and you're all going to go up to Jerusalem. You're all going to spend loads of money and you're all going to have a good time. And that was what's supposed to, that was part of tithing, the third year. So people, I think, people don't realise that. But the tithe of every 3 years, they were supposed to do this. But it was meant to be an expression. Again, I want to emphasise this. It was an expression of thankfulness. So when you get into sort of the Christian scriptures, probably the chapters where this is brought out the most and the most strongly, this attitude of appreciation, is in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and chapters 9. And it sort of, they're powerful narrative stories, because it talks about that of how because right at the end of 1 Corinthians, Paul's talking about, in 1 Corinthians 15, he's talking about making a collection for the saints of Jerusalem, because there'd been an Aramaic famine. You'd read it in the book of Acts that it talks about a great famine was coming across the land. One of the prophets had prophesied that there was going to be a great famine, and so it got desperate situation, and these Jewish proselytes, the people of the Greek proselytes, sorry, not the Jewish proselytes, but the Greek, well, maybe the Greek and the Jewish proselytes who lived outside of Judea and Samaria, the Jewish homeland. They'd heard about all the acute poverty, and they wanted to give. They'd said to Paul and Barnabas, "We want to give. We want to." And Paul and Barnabas said that they didn't just give according to some sort of requirement. It said that they pleaded with them it's very vivid, because it says in their poverty they gave much more than they could even afford to give. It was like this astonishing outpouring of thankfulness to the first Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, because elsewhere Paul sort of talks about it, doesn't he? He says that when he's talking about the relationship between Gentile and Jew, and he's saying that if you've become inheritors of their spiritual blessings, how much more should you be appreciating them with your physical blessings? So throughout the scripture, regardless of whether you're talking about tithing or not tithing, you're seeing this sort of expression of appreciation from the lesser to the greater. And that's what makes 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 such a powerful story, because you hear this story of them wanting to give beyond, it says, beyond their ability to give, they gave. And he says, and the great reward, he brings out that sort of the result of that inner attitude of their giving in 2 Corinthians 9 and 8, chapter 9 verse 8, that God has made all grace abound towards you, that you might have sufficiency in all things, that you might be self-governing, that you might not need no outside aid or support. It's a powerful scripture, because it's basically talking about how this principle of giving, and of giving in the right heart, with the right attitude, this attitude of tithing correctly and understanding that you're giving, however it's expressed, whether it's in this expression to meet the needs of others around you, the charitable sort of tithe, the tithe that is going to ensure that the church can well run. If somebody is ministering to you and you're getting something out from them, if you're involved in some sort of fellowship, and the minister is blessing you and encouraging you and building you up, it's only if you want to honour that person, it just makes sense that you're going to give you are going to help them, so that they don't have to then go out and work a job as well as ministering to you. It's something that's very practical. If you want somebody to be if you want them to be kept, if you want them to make sure that they haven't got that sort of need, a part of your expression, part of your honouring God, is honouring the person that is feeding you. So I've never had any. If you don't feel like that, if you feel for some reason that whatever you're getting from the person that if you're involved in a fellowship, and you feel I just don't feel like I can do that, then you're probably in the wrong place. It's like for me, it's like I'm not immediately a member of any local fellowship here. I'm sort of like a member of the River Church in Tampa, Florida, and but because that's where in a sense where I get fed, my tithe goes to them. Most of the time, there might be other occasions where, where I work as well. I tithe to a degree to them, because I get blessed by them. I'm not going to use the name because stuff that I speak about in these videos, not necessarily, they're not going to be endorsed by where I work, but I just work for a ministry now. That's a main sort of work. So it's very much it's just central. People all this hostility towards tithing is lost if you understand it, the spiritual aspect of tithing is that you're giving as an expression, an inner expression, a tangible physical expression of your inner appreciation of the Lord and who the Lord has put in place to teach you. And that's all tithing is. It's not. And then, now, where it's abused, where people get very legalistic and say that you've got to bring it to the local fellowship and it doesn't go anywhere else. You hear this sort of like preaching from time to time. I've been a believer long enough where you feel as you're supposed to give it to. People can get very rigorous about it, can't they? So it always goes to the local church, never goes anywhere else, or it always goes to the place where you're fed. And there, as principles, fine, that's okay. If you get fed at your local church, your local fellowship, fine. If your pastor comes and come knocking on your door trying to get your tithe, or gets up and preaches about that, then if you're not giving it here, then you probably need to find somewhere, because it's supposed to be an expression of thankfulness. There is this objective part of tithing, which is it's there as a principle. We should be tithing, full stop. We should be tithing. Okay, but the subject aspect of tithing is that it's supposed to be an inner expression of our thankfulness. Now, it's a tithe, it's a tenth, so we start there. But there's also lots of different places to do with sort of like offerings and things. And, and we should be, and offerings in the sense are far more sort of like general, I think, as well, is that, you can be in, but again, within the sort of like, when it talks about tithes and offerings, it's, within this, it does talk about sort of like supporting people that need the support, and there's one passage where in Deuteronomy where it talks about when you bring it up to, again, I think it's the third year of tithing, where you go up there and once you've given it to the priest, and then the foreigners, everybody, they let them eat let everybody eat until they're full. There's this expression of how that when we have resources, that we should be generous. It says that God loves the cheerful giver, or the prompt to do generous. I think the Amplified brings it out quite nicely, the prompt to do. It says God will not do without a cheerful giver. And we're supposed to be helping when we're in a time of our abundance. I mean, it talks about that again in, I think, in 2 Corinthians 8, doesn't it? It talks about in the time of your abundance, you can help those who are in need, and so that in the time of your need, you can receive blessing from those who have an abundance. So there might be, so it's us. And in Phillipians 4, it talks about, that Paul talks about that the Corinthians had entered into this financial support relationship with him, and it said that if you look at the behind the scenes language in Philippians 4, it's accounting language. So they're using accounting words and terms, and they're saying you started up this ledger of giving and receiving, and therefore because you've sent, time and time again, when I was in trouble, you sent me financial support, and that should be an example to us. Paul had ministered to them. Paul had then gone on to different cities and ministered to the people, but those people hadn't supported him, and they must have had some attitude like people get. You're not getting any of my money, and they must have had some sort of that attitude. And so the Philippians had sent him support repeatedly in different times when he was in these other cities to support him in his ministry. And then he's talking about this, and he says, because you came into this partnership relationship with me, therefore my God will meet all your needs according to his riches in glory. So this idea of sort of finding someone and expressing your appreciation for them and supporting them in ministry is something that's central to the Christian experience. So people get hung up and write books about the tithe and spew about the tithe and talk about greedy priests, and that's all stuff that's a distraction. It's meant, and it's stopping you, because the great blessing of tithing is coming into a covenant relationship with God, where the people that he brings into your life that may need support, whether it's ministers or, it's like for me personally, there's different organisations, there's individuals that that I've supported, not much. There's some of this stuff changed when I got married as well, because I had to because it was stuff that I supported. There was, you have to refocus when you get married, and you have to understand, your wife's the most important thing. It's not 3 or 4 missionaries, and it caused trouble in my marriage when I first got there, because my wife got resentful because I was supporting all these other people, and then we were doing without, and that's not good. You have to. Yeah, but thankfully, I've been blessed, I've been prospered, and so I can. That there's individuals that I've supported who are going through Bible college, or there's certain organisations that I support that are dealing, helping people with, helping, giving women who've got pregnant sort of like options rather than just abortion. There's different, and there's different sort of like organisations that I might support at some point, and media organisations which I support. So as well as, if you like, the direct tithing and the direct offerings too, because I love the River Church and what they do, so therefore I'm going to support the River Church and what they do, and but it says that there's so much in the Scripture about being generous and having a good attitude with regards to money, because the love of money, it says the love of money is a root of all evil. So it's a root, it's not just. There's other things which flower into evil as well, but the love of money is one of the greatest, and in our society, which is predominantly money based, because we need money to transact all our normal business, the love of money and having money in an improper relationship with money is something that causes evil to thrive within our society, and that's what's happened. We can see that in our society as people have become greedy, more and more greedy, more self-centered. Then the evil has grown and budded in our society, hasn't it? And so part of the sort of like the process of tithing keeps us outside of ourselves and stops us becoming self-centered and greedy and thinking that everything we have belongs to us, because we, in the sense, we're ultimately stewards of what we get from the Lord. We have to understand that everything that we receive because it comes from the Lord. And so in every aspect of our life there should be this willingness to give God first, because it's quite a good deal in one sense, isn't it? When if you're only being asked for a tenth, that means you've got 9/10 to use as you think. Now there might be, I fully accept, there might be some really, really difficult times in where the pressure and the problem of finances and stuff, it causes people to think, can I tithe on the, do I have to tithe on the gross, do I have to tithe on the net, what do I do, God's supposed to be first, I haven't got enough money to hold these things, there's creditors and it's too easy for people to say, always tithe from the gross, it's very much understanding, but alongside all this pressure of that, because that's very much going to depend on what the people that you're in community, what your church, what your pastors want, what is their attitude in all this situation, because a church where you're in this, it's an interchange of it's giving and receiving. So if somebody's in a time of great problem, a great difficulty, then the church should be supporting them. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that they're exempted from this. They should still nevertheless be giving to God out of what they do get. But because that is the essence of what the tithe is. It's a sense of appreciation, a sense of action. Where I think a lot of people get very offended and start stumbling is when people insist, it's a tenth and it's gross from the top, and that's the way it is, and it's got to go to the local church, and that's sort of like obscuring the fact that it's meant to be something that's coming from you to give. But that I'm not trying to excuse people, because often the reason why we get into financial difficulty is because of lack of discipline with regards to, I've done all these things, a lack of discipline in regard to finances, getting involved in sort of credit agreements that you've got no business getting involved in, or wanting something, and you can get very much in a mess. And so, but the great thing about if we put tithing first, and the action and the processes of tithing first, then other things will sort themselves out. So this is not an expression of legalism, it's not an expression of people being forced to do anything else. There might be times during our life, for whatever reason, that sometimes you can't give what you don't have, but you should always be willing in yourself and in expression of your life to give to God what you do have. And if for some reason if your finances are terrible, you can't tithe, but you can still give to other people from your tithe, or from your time, or whatever else it is. You can still give to people and support people and help people in whatever way you can. If you can't do it with money for whatever reason, you can still do it in other ways. There's always ways you can do stuff. But I do believe that when we get stuff in order and we get blessed, one of the greatest avenues to receiving more blessing is taking the blessing that God gives us and to give back to Him of what is His, because it is His. The tithe is His, but it's an expression of our love for Him. And so it's nothing to do with the law, it's nothing to do with legal, it's a spiritual principle of us as the lesser acknowledging the greater. Abraham acknowledged that the Melchizedek, the king of Salem who came out, was the greater than he was. He was more worthy of more honour, and therefore he gave to him. And so that's that. So I hope this is sort of removed some of this fire from this issue, because it's meant to be something which is, if I'm going to summarise what I've sort of like said in the last three, it's our relationship to the law. We're still bound to the moral aspects of the law. The law that is our ethical guide. It's also a guide in matters of penology, which is prison, justice, government, and it's also sort of like a matter of how we construct how we govern ourselves. It gives them pattern of three different types of balances of power within government, and so we can take these, and then we've got this issue, this fiery issue of tithing, and we can, if we've got a proper inner attitude, then it's going to be a measure of prosperity for us, and it's an avenue, it's a gateway. That's the great promise of Malachi. He'll pour out a blessing on us when we've got the right inner attitude. So I think I have to stop there. But this, I hope that's sort of taken out. I hope this has sort of like given us a little bit of understanding. The law is something that's a blessing. It's a great thing. It's something that provides a framework for life, and that the tithe is something, is a principle. This principle of the theonomic principle of unless something is explicitly contradicted and changed in the New Testament from the Old, that whatever's said in the Old is assumed in the New. And you can see that in some of the New Testament writers, in James and Paul. They're assuming it, and Paul's great exposition in the Hebrews, and even when he's talking in Galatians about there's a relationship we have with the Lord, there's an assumption this is correct. Adultery doesn't become any more acceptable to us. There's nothing explicitly talked about, about certain sexual sins in the New Testament, but they're talked about in the Old. That doesn't mean that suddenly it's okay to be involved in incestuous and involved with sex with animals and stuff just because it's not mentioned explicitly in the New. It's still binding in the Old, and that's having a proper understanding of our relationship to the law. And then this big subject is tithing. Remember, tithing's a matter of expression of honour of the lesser to the greater. It predates the law. We see it with Abraham. We see an elaborate expression of it in the law, But then we see the post law in the Paul talking about, that very much more of the subjective element of it being, because we have the objective requirement to tithe, it's a spiritual principle, but then we see the whole subjective element of it as of it should be coming from our heart. It's an expression of appreciation to God. It's an expression of support to others. We want to support our brothers and sisters who don't have what we have. It's very much an expression of sort of like a charitable giving, of supporting, stopping people needing to be dependent on the government. Okay, so I hope I've been understanding how important it's been. So I'll just say goodbye to my wife. I can hear her going. So thank you very much. See you again.